All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. This is a really interesting, unique event. There are people here who have flown here from different states. There's like more than 5 people who flew here just for this.
Wow.
And it's not just, thank you, man. I appreciate that. Of course that's flattering, but thanks, man. We might need that about 1 hour in. Yeah. And that's very flattering and all, but I'm not crazy. No one's flying several hours because of me. I mean, I'm pretty fucking smart and cool, but I'm not that smart and cool.
But you're sweet, Justin. You're very sweet.
Well, thank you, Curtis. I appreciate that. The reason I'm commenting on this before we even begin is because you all need to, people really need to understand that there is an extraordinary demand out there for true, radical, dangerous, intellectual thought and expression and discussion. And there is an unfortunately constrained supply. There's an artificially constrained supply of true intellectual life. And people should not have to fly hundreds of miles to come listen to someone like Curtis talk. There is a huge demand for it. It's not being met. And unfortunately, the way things are working out right now is if you want this kind of thing, you have to make it yourself. DIY, baby, punk rock culture, dude. Get a venue where you live. Put on things like this. The institutions aren't going to do it for you. Academics aren't going to do it for you. Almost everyone out there right now who is kind of representing some sort of intellectual posture, let's be honest, at least 90% of them are utterly fake. Absolute fakers. And if you want real intellectual life, no one's going to give it to you necessarily, but if you build it, they will come. Look at this. I'm not that famous, people. I'm really not. I do not have that big of a following, and yet I do this little event, and people will fly across states. So my exhortation, I want to start essentially with an exhortation. If you think this is cool, if you enjoy this talk, if you were excited to come to this, and if it lives up even halfway to what you wanted it to be, the type of intellectual kind of community or dialogue, the exciting, kind of dangerous, edgy, intellectual experience that you want it to be, which I think Curtis and I are both committed to making it that for you, then go home and do it yourselves. Provide this for the other people around you. People should not have to fly this far just to be a part of this. So that's just a little exhortation.
Fortunately, you're watching this on YouTube in porn mode.
You can hit record now. We're going to start. We're good? You sure? Okay, cool. So, okay, that's my little exhortation because people should not have to fly this far to be a part of something like this. Welcome to this little event that we've put on. This is my first live show of my podcast. The podcast is called Other Life, and it's pretty much all about me trying to find true intellectual life wherever it exists. And today, that mostly means on the internet. So most of the people I interview for my podcast are bloggers, kind of strange, interesting, unique, idiosyncratic, and very courageous people, typically, or just weird people who are out there, pursuing some type of independent intellectual life that is escaping this kind of institutional apparatus that is so constraining on so many people nowadays. That's what my podcast is all about. That's why it's called Other Life. It's about a different kind of life. I started it when I was an academic, and I needed to find people to actually talk about interesting, real stuff with. So that's my podcast, Other Life, and this is the first time I'm doing a live show. So yeah, this is a milestone for me, and I'm very happy to have you all here. So enough on general introductions. I would like to now introduce our special guest here tonight, Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug, and I'm gonna pick his brain about many things. I have some questions that were actually submitted to me by other people.
Fuck.
Yeah, no. But Curtis has told me anything goes. He's told me, there's nothing off limits. Luckily, I'm a fairly friendly interviewer. I don't have any hardballs for you.
I'm rethinking that
now. So I'll give you a little bit of introduction. Most of you are here. You probably already know Curtis's shtick. But what I think is most
good word.
Come on in, guys. What I think is most, Curtis is mostly known for being a reactionary blogger and, of course, a brilliant startup founder. But in these circles, you're probably kind of most known for being a rather reactionary blogger. But what I think is kind of most interesting about you, Curtis, is not primarily your reactionary qualities, which are interesting for sure, and we'll get there. But primarily, you're a computer scientist or an engineer. Is that what would you say, engineer, or what's the label you would use?
I like to think of myself as a computer programmer.
Computer programmer. There you go. Old school. I like the modesty. And so I tend to see your writings mostly through that lens. I see you as your blog, which we're going to kind of dissect over the next hour or two.
Shit.
you know, to me, the defining characteristic of your worldview and your political theory is not so much your reactionary qualities, but I see your reactionary qualities as kind of downstream of your engineer mentality or your, you know, computer programming type of mentality and experience. I see you as Curtis likes to, I think, kind of hack into the source code of a lot of conventional wisdom, in particular kind of the politically correct wisdom. And then once he's kind of hacked into your source code, he wants to bring you places that maybe you don't necessarily want to go, but he wants to kind of lure you there.
Yeah, that's a you know, fairly insightful comment, Justin. I would say something a little close to that, which is just that I like to think from first principles. And so, you know, when I see a large system or a complicated system, I'm like, okay, you know, what would this look like if you designed it from scratch? Clearly, this is a product of history. It's spent a lot of time, you know, evolving. You know, as I record, there's a lot of Americans concerned about their 401ks. And so I'm like, what is the stock market thing? Where did this come from? How does this work? You know, this is a very interesting kind of question to me. And I think that approach can be used by a lot of people for a lot of different things.
Excellent. So my intuition there is not wrong.
Mostly.
Okay. So I think that's enough of an introduction. He's a computer programmer, a well-known blogger, and a founder of an enigmatic startup called Urbit, which we might have some time to get into a little bit too, now that you've formally walked away from Urbit. I think, are you now a little bit more free to discuss it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit more free, but I'm also more distant from it. So, you know, what I say should not be taken as gospel. You know, anyone can read my my resignation letter. You know, and amusingly enough, my sort of unusually for Silicon Valley, everything I wrote in that is true. So,
cool, great. Then I don't think you need much more of a warm up. I think we can get right into the interesting stuff that people are probably here to hear you talk about. I see you as very interested in, well, you're kind of a pill dispenser, aren't you?
Yeah, sort of.
You like dispensing pills, whether they be red pills or most recently clear pill is a recent idea you have.
Yeah, I'm not. You know, I have questions about that as a marketing concept, but you know, I'm pretty sincere about it.
Right. I take that as sincere. In fact, to my understanding, you actually popularized the term red pill in the political context. Is that right?
Yeah, that's actually true. I can tell you actually where I was when I came up with that, which is in the Haight-Ashbury at Hayden Masonic. I was in the People's Cafe, and the People's Cafe is the decor in the People's Cafe is entirely like 60s revolutionary stickers. So, you know, it's a very kind of positive place. And you know, to those who have seen The Matrix, it's obvious that, you know, the red pill is this kind of left-wing, you know, analogy. But you know, what if you made it a right-wing one? Wouldn't that be interesting?
Right. So what I thought would be a good exercise to kick things off is maybe you could dispense a kind of pill right now. And I was thinking a really—
Can you be more specific?
Yeah. I was thinking a really good place to start would be on the concept of democracy.
Oh, sure. Okay. You know, let's talk about democracy for a second. You know, actually have a nice little line prepared on that, which is you know, people are very fond on Twitter and so forth of these political quadrants. And one way you can draw a political quadrant is to say, you can ask two questions. You know, is your country a democracy? And should it be a democracy? So the set of people who answer no to both of those questions, that's a relatively small set, and it's a pretty freaking weird set. So yeah, I'm kind of part of that set. So that's my perspective.
The reason I wanted to start with democracy as a good test case is because it's arguably one of the most universally applauded concepts or values right now in kind of mainstream culture, right? Democracy.
Well, I was going to stop you before you said, you know, right now. Actually, it's pretty much universally reviled, but it's only universally reviled if you consider all historical periods as equal.
Right. For most of the history of the term, it was a bad thing.
Yeah, because people, you know, saw, you know, the history of Athens and so forth, and you know, the history of Athens basically is an independent principality, basically ends with democracy, and you know, the history of the Roman Republic ends in a very turbulent way.
Right.
And so, you know, who's it? You know, John Adams, you know, the greatest American political philosopher, of course, second president. I'm trying to recall his words on democracy verbatim, but he's like, this is the worst political system ever, and this is one of the founders of the main philosopher of the main person whose kind of political writing still holds up from the American founding.
Yes, that's right. I mean, for most of the history of the term democracy, it essentially means what we now think of as something like anarchy. It's just kind of seen as synonymous with chaos, something to be avoided.
Or if you're familiar with the word populism, used as a pejorative. So one simple example that I sometimes use is, let's take two words, politics and democracy. So you'll notice that when you think about those words, you have very different associations with either. So suppose you were to say, oh, we're going to politicize this. We're going to politicize U.S. foreign policy. We're going to politicize the State Department. We're going to politicize the coronavirus. That's clearly a very bad thing to do. But if you're going to democratize this, if you're going to bring democracy to China or whatever, wasn't there that great Guns N' Roses album, Chinese Democracy? Can you buy that in China? I sometimes wonder, so, if you're going to democratize something, there's absolutely no question that democracy has a completely positive set of associations, and politics, like office politics is bad, anything political is bad. And yet you look at these two words and you're like, wait, they're synonyms. But one of them is good and one of them is bad. And if you can explain that, basically, I don't think you have any need for any of my pills.
It's almost like in your grand narrative, democracy is sort of the root of all problems in some sense.
Oh, that would be going too far. I mean, democracy is a very legitimate. It's one of the many, like one of the three basic political systems, and as a political system, even more, it's basically a form of political energy. Even in a country like you're in the Soviet Union, there's no real democracy. Maybe there are fake elections, but you can say, does democratic power still exist? Of course it does, because it's what helped overthrow the Soviet Union. So, this basic force never, at least abstractly, disappears, and certainly no one has refuted the categorization of Aristotle into three political systems: democracy, rule of the many; oligarchy, rule of the few; and monarchy, rule of the one.
Real quick, not to digress too much, but when was the last time you did a public talk IRL?
2012.
2012, without being canceled.
Without being canceled. Well, I did no. I mean, I've done technical talks like once or twice, but yeah, I've never. I don't usually do public appearances, so I'm kind of a virgin here.
Oh, okay, interesting. Okay,
you'll have to excuse me if I seem a little nervous and weird.
No, you seem great. I was only asking because I'm thinking a lot lately about kind of the shifting tides of the culture wars. It seems to me that something like this would maybe not have even been possible a year ago. The protest energy might have been too great, threats of having it shut down or whatever the case might be. Whereas now I have this kind of sense that, personally, that we're kind of turning a corner where this type of thing is now more possible. I was just curious if you have any similar type of intuition.
Well, that may be true in a sense. The one thing that I try really hard to do that has been sort of the perennial kind of, if I may use the term, shit show of the last 3 years is that I feel like a lot of people, when they create, heterodox content, the word, do you know the origin of the word trolling, by the way?
I'm not sure that I do.
Let me tell you the origin of the word trolling, and then Please. I'll tell you why I don't troll. The origin of the word trolling, first of all, has anyone ever trolled, in fishing? Any fishermen in the room? I can see, okay, yeah, that's good. Slowly from the back of the boat, you're dragging basically this lure, right? I have trolled, I have fished for bass. It's lower class to fish for bass, which is why I like it. Like people of quality fish for trout, and they certainly don't troll. Nonetheless, the word trolling as we use it now was actually a product of the Vietnam War. Did you know this?
I did not.
So it was invented, with a clear analogy to the fishing practice. Basically, U.S. What were called wild weasels, which were like an F-104, I think, outfitted with some kind of electronic intercept category, would basically fly across surface-to-air missile sites in North Vietnam, trying to get surface-to-air missiles shot at them so they could basically lock onto the launchers and destroy them with counter missiles. So anytime you're thinking of the word trolling, you should be like, where are my radar-seeking missiles? And if you're just like out there basically trying to attract fire, you should really question why you're doing this. And of course that question could be asked about the whole Vietnam War, right? And so, when people basically go, there were like, if you remember in early 2017, there were like these like provocations in Berkeley, like these Antifa, Breitbart riots. It seems like something from like the 15th century now. The whole thing, was really quite, it was very LARPy, if you know the term. It was very kind of pretend. And the thing that I dislike about it most, and the one thing that I would basically caution all heterodox thinkers about, is that the one thing you really don't want to do is inhabit the stereotypes of your opponents. So basically, you have, anyone who's kind of, working in some direction has people working against them, right? And those people who are working against you see you as a certain kind of person. They imagine, oh, this is what our enemies are like. And because their frame is so dominant, it's really easy to inhabit that caricature. Because basically, you've been taught by them, oh, this is what, our enemies are like. They believe this, they believe that, they do this, they do that. And if you basically get that so deeply into your head that you're like, oh, I oppose you, I do this, I do that, you don't really have your own frame. You're still operating in their frame. And you're operating in a way which is much more valuable to them than if you even supported them.
So was this type of strategy behind your blog, Unqualified Reservations? Were you thinking about these things proactively when you first set out to do that blog?
No, I was crazy. I should never have written anything at all. Do
you mean that? You don't mean that?
There's part of me that means that, but there's part of me that doesn't. When I think about the problem of being a dissident, I'm always reminded. Do you know the writer Ryszard Kapuscinski?
I don't.
He wrote mainly in the 80s and 90s. I think he died in the early 2000s. He was a journalist, and he was a correspondent for the official Polish communist news agency. Fortunately for him, he was also an amazing writer, and he got sent to Africa. So Africa is kind of relatively tangentially related to Polish communism. So he could not really exactly write whatever he wanted, but he could write stuff that was actually worthwhile content. There's some controversy over whether there's any actual truth in his books or whether they're just wholly made up. But even if they're wholly made up, they're pretty good. And so he wrote one book called The Emperor, which is about Ethiopia. And so he went to Ethiopia, and everyone here has heard of Haile Selassie, right? Like from Bob Marley songs or something. So Haile Selassie was this emperor of Ethiopia, and he was kind of a nutcase. He had pet lions. He used to feed dissidents to the lions. It was a little weird. So eventually it was sort of weird enough, and what we now call civil society, got started to kind of organize against him, and he was overthrown. The same thing happens. It always happens. He was overthrown by the liberals, and then the liberals got stabbed in the back by the committed Marxist-Leninists, and they established this regime called the Derg, which was about 100 times worse than Haile Selassie ever was. But so in the early days of the Derg, Ryszard Kapuscinski, this Polish journalist, goes to Ethiopia. And he interviews all kinds of people who were basically part of the old regime. Ethiopia, as you may or may not know, is in some ways more of a Middle Eastern country than an African country, and it's a Christian country. It has this very old nobility and this very old elite, and so these people were, the former employees of Haile Selassie. So there's this one interview from this book, or maybe completely fake interview, I don't really know, that sticks in my mind, where he goes and interviews a couple who are part of this old this government service class, who have basically had a son who has become a dissident and subsequently comes to, of course, a very bad end. And he's interviewing this couple, and he's like, tell me when you first suspected that there might be a problem. And, the wife was like, well, one day my husband came to me and he was like, we have a problem. What is the problem? The problem is Tesfaye, their son, Tesfaye has started to think. And as a parent, I really relate to that, in a way, like, the anyone who is interested in actually getting ahead or succeeding in this world would be very well advised not to think. And if they start thinking, they should, and I'm serious about this, they should keep it to themselves. They should hide, there's a great term, hide your power level. Hide your power level. By all means, if you start thinking, don't be like a 15-year-old Ethiopian boy who's going to end up being shot in a month and a half. So that's I think certainly is a valid perspective. On the other hand, what was this line of Shaw? A reasonable person adapts himself to society. And an unreasonable person insists on adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable people.
And what about people who are cursed with this drive or this necessity to think, despite the odds?
There's a great line. There's another writer I really adore, which is the writer Freda Utley. So she was writing in the 30s and 40s, and she was a communist. She was a communist in the 30s. In the 30s, basically anyone who was smart or cool was a communist. The list of smart, cool people who were not communists is an interesting list. Otherwise, they were a communist. So Ellie was a communist, and she was so committed to the cause that she went and married a Russian, a bright young Russian guy who was, part of the revolution, and actually moves to Russia with him. She moves to Russia with him, and then in the mid-30s, then shit goes bad. He disappears into the gulag. She never hears from him again. And she has like a baby son. So she comes back to the US and she has all these chic friends, right? Because communism has always been this very, very chic movement. And she's like, friends, help me. Because the Soviet Union really cares about its friends abroad. Sorry. And, of course, her friends are just like, do I know you? Do I know this person? Who is this anti-Soviet person who's knocking on my door? They're like, fuck you. And so, of course, she gets nowhere with this, right? Sorry. And, she goes and talks to her friend, Edith Hamilton. Edith Hamilton, the great writer on mythology, great 30s writer. She talks to Edith Hamilton, and she's like, why are all my friends, stabbing me in the back? And Edith Hamilton is like, well, you really shouldn't expect the material rewards of success to come along with the spiritual rewards of telling the truth. You shouldn't expect that. And I think that's true today, and you've experienced that, right, Justin? I'll let you talk for a sec.
Yeah, sure. So your view.
I think it's possible. One thing you didn't do, Justin, was introduce yourself. And I think it's possible that there may be some people watching who might know who I am, but don't know who you are.
I wouldn't be so presumptuous to introduce myself. You can if you want.
All right. Well, unfortunately I don't know that much about you. But what I know is let me just say what I know about Mr. Murphy.
I can if you want. But go ahead.
No, I'll tell you what I know. Justin Murphy is I would describe him as a defrocked academic. Is that right?
I take issue with that. They couldn't fire me because I quit, baby.
Yeah, that sounds very right.
I was about to be defrocked, yes. But I'm a proud Irish Catholic man, and I just didn't want to give them that pleasure. Many people advised me, actually, to let them fire me, let them go through with the
I would have advised you
the big stink. I believe you did. I believe you emailed me, actually.
I cold emailed you, actually.
Yeah, so I thought long and hard about it, but I decided ultimately, and this is the only thing that's actually interesting about my case. It's not me per se, but what I do think is interesting about my particular case is my phenomenology of going through this conflict. My kind of cost-benefit calculus at the time. I was a professor for 6 years, a successful professor. I'm a political scientist by training. I was based in England at the University of Southampton. And I was doing very well. Everything was going pretty much according to plan.
Is that what they call a red brick university?
Yes, that's right, as a matter of fact. And pretty much I bought into this myth that I was always kind of conducting my life on, which was that if I play by the rules in academia and I publish in good journals and I climb the ranks and I establish myself and prove myself and get tenure, I had the British version of tenure, I was set. Then finally there would come a time when I could speak freely, where I could really do what I want and I could be free. That was what my advisors, that's what my PhD advisors always told me. That's what I thought from the day that I set out to pursue an academic career. And I guess I was the only person stupid enough to actually take that promise literally. I mean, I'm not kidding. Like once I really got arrived, I got the British version of tenure. I had good publications in top journals. I literally said to myself pretty consciously, okay, now I'm going to start being free. I started the podcast. I'm like, I'm going to actually start blogging about whatever I want. I'm going to start talking about whatever I want. And I'm going to really let the chips fall where they may, because this whole academic game is only worth it. But paying all of those dues over 10 years or more was only worth it to get that freedom. That was what I was in it for. So I decided to take it. And immediately I started getting flack. It was very clear, very apparent that that type of freedom was never going to come. And at the same time, the academic institutions were getting more and more oppressive, more and more annoying. The amounts of paperwork you have to do, the amounts of red tape, the political correctness, all of the costs of being an academic were increasing at the same time that all of my creative, independent, intellectual work on the internet was gaining more and more traction, and it was more and more fun. And the ability to do that freely and independently on the internet seemed to be increasing at the same time that my academic career seemed more and more miserable. So that was when, you know, at that time, I'm realizing all of this. You know, when my administrator comes to me and says that I'm not allowed to use the word retard on Twitter, I was like, fuck you, I'm going to say whatever I want on Twitter. And yeah, it was clear that push was going to come to shove. They probably would have pushed me out. But honestly, I just didn't want to deal with the hassle. So, and I genuinely decided that I had better prospects as, you know, an independent intellectual pursuing a full-time intellectual career for the rest of my life, because I'm still young. I still have piss and vinegar. I was like, I can carve out a new path. I can make a new model. I think I see it possible. So I was like, peace out, and I decided to do my own thing. I didn't need them to fire me or whatever. So that's my little intro about me. Yeah, sure.
So kind of my theory. You know, I dropped out of grad school in computer science for somewhat different, but certainly not political reasons. But you know, I think I came to the same realization as Justin, but somewhat sooner than Justin. That you know, essentially here was this form and this kind of form of science, and you know, I come into this and I'm like, I take it at face value. I'm like, this is what it appears to be, and then you get in there and you basically discover that you're actually training to be a bureaucrat. And my parents were bureaucrats, so I kind of know the experience pretty well. And I'm like, I'm actually, what I'm trying to do here is make alliances. What I'm trying to do here is make friends who will scratch my back when they scratch theirs. I'm trying to be popular. I'm trying to be on a team player. I'm trying to be with the program, you know, and I'm like, you know, this is like, you know, I'm sorry to be arrogant, but was Isaac Newton a team player? Isaac Newton was a weirdo and a nerd and a like just an impossible person to deal with. And like science, the kinds of people who created you know, the science and academia and literature that we know could never have succeeded in these institutions and cannot succeed in these institutions. And unless they have just these amazing talents. And I've seen people who can do that. You know, I wouldn't try like political science, that's crazy, but like computer science, sure. There are people who are amazing computer scientists in a very fundamental sense, and also amazing bureaucrats. And those people are very successful and they deserve all the success they get. But they're an exception.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to talk about Unqualified Reservations, your notorious blog that you wrote in the late 2000s. You seem to have some misgivings about ever having gained any type of recognition or readership for your blog. You seem to have mixed emotions. I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, you know, it's always very difficult when you have two I hesitate to say careers. I have 0 careers, but the two, you know, very different directions you're pursuing, because they can easily, you know, interfere with each other. It's like one of my favorite, you know, historical figures or artists generally is, do you know Wyndham Lewis?
Of course.
You know, and so Wyndham Lewis is both, you know, a very, you know, not just a legitimate, really a leading literary figure, and also a leading figure in painting. And you know, his paintings and his literary work are both all of his writing actually needs editing, but otherwise it's very good. And so, but those careers didn't really interfere with each other. There's another kind of thing that people will do where they make a career in some technical field and then make a shit ton of money, which hasn't actually happened to me, and then quit and go and be, some kind of intellectual, philosophical, literary figure or whatever. But doing the reverse is very, very difficult.
Was the blog in your mind when you set out to write it? Was it just for fun, or would you say you had intellectual ambitions to really kind of solve some puzzles around political theory?
I would say that I had, certainly intellectual ambitions, but well, I've of course have no political ambitions, but I also, I was just not really that interested in who would read my blog. In fact, I never even read the comments, which was probably a mistake. I absolutely hate reading about myself in any context whatsoever. Like many neurotic writers. But I was just like, in a way, that era was kind of the last gasp of the old internet way of doing things, where you basically, it's like I started posting on like Usenet in like 1989, right? So, that was some time ago. In that world, like the internet was this weird thing that no one had heard of. Like my own project Urbit today, with which I'm no longer associated. Being something that no one had heard of, it just provided this really nice intellectual quality, because you could not imagine it mattering. I mean, I remember the first time that I saw the internet mentioned in the New York Times. It may have been the first time the internet was mentioned in the New York Times. It was the fall of 1988, and Robert Morris had unleashed the famous Morris worm. And so you're reading the New York Times, and then you read about the internet in the New York Times. It's like your cousin was in the New York Times, right?
You write a lot about this, actually, how you're very specifically resigned from any type of trying to have political efficacy of any kind. You write about this throughout unqualified reservations. You say this frequently. And do you think that that's actually a kind of necessary precondition for pursuing a real kind of long-term, original, creative, intellectual project in some sense?
Absolutely. And let me, in a way, turn that question back on you. I would say that, you can't really be free. Can I get all Buddhist on you?
What's that?
Can I get all Buddhist on you?
Yeah, go for it, man.
You can't really be free until you free yourself from desire, man. And to free yourself from, one of my big things, if those of you who've read my latest series, The Clear Pill, featured in the Claremont Institute's American Mind. My editors have been yammering at me for part 3 for about 4 months. I'm working on it. So, one of the things that I really tend to focus on is this word themos, which is a Greek word that can be translated in a number of ways. I think the simplest translation is ambition. But in Plato, you see this explicit parallel between themos and eros. Eros being, of course, sexual desire. And so desire for power and desire for sex have always been, very, very closely related, especially if you're Harvey Weinstein. And these are like, these were always, now, of course, the received wisdom is never turn down money, sex, or power, but, before the modern world, that was actually considered kind of decadent. And the willingness to sort of resist desire, that's not just a Buddhist thing, right? And so, when I look at, say, Justin's experience in academia, I would say that he expected academia to be one thing, but he found it another. And the way in which he found it another was he expected it to be something that was not corrupted by power, but in fact it was corrupted by power. And so, in a way, the academic systems, even of a red brick university like the University of Southampton, these academic systems, I'm sorry, I'm just being derogatory for no reason at all. These academic systems evolved in a world where they were the relevance was very low. I mean, even, the first, of course, America had this amazing experience where they elected Woodrow Wilson, who was a professor of political science, president. I'm sure that can never happen again. But before then, if you look at like America in 1900, the idea that professors would tell the government what to do, as you probably know, being a political scientist, was like, it was weird. It would be like hairdressers suddenly took control of Washington, right? And everything was about hair. And suddenly, of course, academics have a much better claim to rule than hairdressers. No offense to any hairdressers out there. But what happened, what led to this sort of kind of way of living that we have now is that you had these, people like the political science professors of 100 years ago. I don't know if you've read any, Charles Francis Adams Jr.
Not much, but at least I know the name.
I recommend anyone read his 1900 American Historical Association address on history, if you're interested in history. He was basically like, look, politics is, conducted on this incredibly crude level. And you have, when you look at what people are thinking about when they vote, they just have no idea what's going on. It's this incredibly long essay that was delivered as an address. He goes through every presidential election between like 1856 and like 1900. And he's just like, in this election, the voters had no clue. In that election, we can see that the voters had no clue. Finally, this election, they had no idea what they were doing. And, he goes through basically both sides of each election were just out of touch with reality. And so, this is kind of the anti-democracy of very early progressivism. And so he's like, okay, here's this ship that is not being steered. It's like a ship without a pilot or a ship with a drunken pilot. Who is capable of steering this ship? And of course, the answer is very clear. Now, Charles Francis Adams Jr., I mentioned John Adams, earlier. Charles Francis Adams Jr. is actually the great-grandson of John Adams. So, he's this is as blue as American blood comes. And so, in a way, here's this kind of rising academic aristocracy that says, wow, here is a ship with no pilot or a drunken pilot. Someone should take control of it, someone competent, someone who just knows what they're doing, who can actually think. This seemed like a great idea at the time. And what people didn't realize is that basically, this is kind of the great lesson of Tolkien that somehow has really been missed, is that basically when you put on the ring, you become something different. It's like, my son who's 9, he just read Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, he actually asked me, he's like, why doesn't Gandalf just put on the ring and fucking kick ass? He didn't put it quite that way. And I'm like, well, that question is never really answered in the book. And actually, the book never really tells you. It's like, like Bilbo puts on the ring. Bilbo's this magical power of like he has no magical powers at all, so it just makes him invisible. But for Gandalf, he could like turn a mountain into a swamp, right? But he would be corrupted by that power. And so in a way, like, in a world where someone like Justin could just be a scholar and just be like, oh, I'm interested in some issue of political science, and it didn't matter, that would be very easy. But in a world where it does matter, what you're going to find is that it matters. And that's going to attract people like your dean or whatever, who are going to be like, this guy is not a team player. This guy's not with the program.
But do you think that because so much intellectual activity, or supposedly intellectual activity today, is colonized by this kind of power-hungry, institutionalized kind of corruption, is it not in some sense a great moment for true intellectuals who want to just turn to their blog or write books for truly radically disinterested, truth-seeking purposes? Is not now perhaps one of the greatest times to be doing that, precisely because so much of what passes for intellectual activity has nothing to do with intellectual activity?
Well, it's a great moment, but it's not an easy moment. Let me tell you about the time I was detained in the New Zealand airport, or let me not. But of course, as I said, with Fred Ali, earlier, if it's easy, you're wasting your time, right? It's certainly not easy, but it's an interesting, promising time. It's like, to answer this question, had a little. I really don't know Justin at all. I don't even trust him. But I had an email exchange with him where I was like, clearly what he's doing down here is pretty interesting and pretty cool. And when I look at all of you in the audience, I see that you're pretty cool people. I'm also older than about all of you, which is interesting, and always a good sign, actually. So I was like, Justin, I think this is still available, but anyone who is interested in doing the same thing can go on YouTube, and there's an old PBS documentary about David Geffen. So people in the room probably know who David Geffen was, right? So basically, David Geffen, I think he has a boat the size of the USS Nimitz or something. David Geffen has done very well for himself, and he hasn't done well by being maybe a little bit of a parasite. But what David Geffen did, and this PBS documentary is very informative, is he basically figured out how to sell the hippies. And his procedure in selling the hippies was, I'm going to become a hippie. I'm going to move into a hippie house, hang out with other hippies, listen to their hippie music. And when I listen to their hippie music, I'll be like, these people are good. These people, not so much. And, hippie music, it varied a lot, right? And then he's like, I'm going to take the good people and I'm going to stamp them on wax and I'm going to sell them to the American people who, it's 1967 or whatever, believe that, Satan has come back to the earth in Southern California. Of course, in the shape of Manson, Satan does come back, which is kind of part of the problem. But I'm going to sell this to, all of America, and I'm going to get incredibly rich. And of course, that even the stuff he recorded is, some of it has lasted as art, some of it has not lasted, but, he was seriously trying. He was actually trying to, here is something amazing that's happening. Maybe he was a bit of a hippie himself. I don't know, but he certainly did drugs with them. I think. To sort of bring that into the modern world, there was a piece I read in the New York Times about 6 months ago or so, maybe 6 months, a year or something, and it was about the YouTube rabbit hole of radicalization. You probably heard about the YouTube rabbit hole of radicalization. They're working hard on that one, folks. I wouldn't be surprised just because I mentioned this. I've doubled your chances of getting demonetized. But it was a good story. It was really well reported, a really solid story, and but there was this sort of interesting moment where they interviewed this YouTube engineer got a comment from this engineer who'd done this kind of internal engagement study on YouTube, and he was like, well, we don't usually think of this as a vertical, but if you did think of it as a vertical, and I'm sure, for his query purposes, he's defining this just incredibly, ultimately broadly, right? But he's like, if you did think of it as a vertical, then basically, if you looked at our top 4 verticals, it would be like gaming and music and sports and the alt-right, and that's what the article said. Now obviously I'm reading this in the New York Times, so we have to discount this a little bit, but the thing is, and this is sort of both the problem and the paradox in a way, is that there's a sort of enormous demand for heterodox content out there. And what's missing is basically David Geffen to come and say, this is the good heterodox content, this other stuff is just crap. And the thing is...
So you really do get my project then? I appreciate that.
Maybe I invented it first, but yeah, no, I think that is your... well, the thing is, one of the things is... when you're looking at anything that's true or makes sense, what you'll see is that a lot of people invent it at the same time. And, it's only people like you who execute, rather than me who sits in my room and just scribbles, who actually gets things done. I mean, and so it's great that you create your own content, but you may have more of a role as a David Geffen.
Interesting. Go on.
But yeah, that's in a sense the level of opportunity, and what's missing is when you think about I think when most people think about, there's sort of many meanings of this, strange term alt-right, right? What it meant in 2015 is not what it means now. As you're well aware, there are plenty of people in the world with the power to change the meaning of a word. Not individuals, but systems. And so in a way, that word has changed. You might say now, if you were casting the broadest possible net, dissident right, deep right. I tried to make this catch on, but totally failed. People only, if you're coining things, like almost everything will fail. You just got to bear that in mind. And so in a way, when you look at the breadth of that set, what's really missing there is a really just savage quality filter, like a really ruthless quality filter. And that's not even going to be a filter. The one thing I do think, Justin gets many things, but one thing I do think Justin gets is that filter, when most people think about that filter, they're still thinking these very conventional terms. So they're just like, the moderate side of this is okay, but then there are these people who go too far. I wouldn't say, thinking about it in those terms is very unproductive, but there are certainly many. It's very, very easy. There are many ways to just simply be wrong, and you're just never going to win by being wrong.
I'm curious, what kind of traffic was unqualified reservations getting at its peak?
I never looked.
You never looked?
No.
Really?
No, I never looked.
Okay, interesting. If you were writing unqualified reservations today from scratch, let's say you were at the same age that you were writing unqualified reservations, but it's today, would you do anything differently?
Yeah, I'd probably do everything differently. I mean, for one thing, the age of the blog is gone. So a couple of things have changed about the internet. The age of the blog is gone. It's dead. It's over. It's done. You can't bring it back. It's very sad. The age in which the internet was sort of something special that not everyone was on is completely dead. Basically in Usenet in 1991, even, you sort of relied on the abstruseness of this medium to provide this kind of passive gatekeeping function, which is the same kind of function. Anyone here been to Burning Man? Probably maybe one or two people. It's the same kind of gatekeeping function that being out in the desert provides to Burning Man, and it just provides this awesome experience of being with people who are your people. And that's why people go to Burning Man. It's not because they like the fucking desert. If you could actually have the first Burning Mans were on the beach, right? And in like Santa Cruz or something. Then it started getting too popular, and that's what happened to Usenet. So basically, when people were writing blogs I started my blog in 2007. And that was very late, and I always used this very old-fashioned, ugly-looking blogger template, which was even more embarrassing. Of course, there were no ads on blogs now. I'm always embarrassed when I open someone's WordPress and I see the ads that they're earning $6 a month off of. I'm just embarrassed for you that you have to present your content this way, and you don't even have to. And so, furthermore, so the idea of there sort of being these decentralized sort of pieces of the internet, that's not the real internet anymore. That's not what the internet is. That should be reality. That should be what the next network is. But that's certainly not what the internet is. So that's dead. The other thing that's dead is when you look at these big, these hosting services like Blogger, which was once an independent company, but then was acquired by Google, of course. You basically, when you first started using these centralized internet services, the way you thought about it was basically, this was just kind of a more convenient way of implementing the decentralized internet. The ethos was still decentralized. And so the idea that you would publish a blog on Blogger, and then you would get an email from some Google staffer being like, oh, you can't write this essay, or your Gmail account would disappear because you said the wrong thing in your blog, that was unthinkable. That, you could not imagine that happening in 2008. And maybe in a sense, maybe I had an intuitive sense that era was ending, but it's certainly long since disappeared.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the things people often ask me is, Justin, why are you so interested in people like Curtis Yarvin or Nick Land? Why are you interested in these kind of extreme right-wingers? And they often take this as evidence that I am therefore an extreme right-winger, which I'm not.
Justin, are you going to heil for us tonight? Are we going to?
No. No, I wouldn't count on that. And what I tell people often is that people on the left should be really interested in smart people on the right, even the extreme right, who are smart and who are able to correctly and adequately kind of push away the dumbest, most violent and nasty aspects of the right. So someone like you, for instance, you're very explicit about having very little interest in white nationalism, for instance.
Yeah, I keep meaning to actually go on like Nazi podcasts and argue with them. I may actually do this, you know, and like, because these people are just, I don't want to be arrogant, but I think they're just defenseless against me. And it's not like, you know, the right way, whether you're arguing with a Nazi or a progressive or anything in between, you know, no, they're very different. You know, whether you're arguing with any of those, you know, it should never be an argument. You're not arguing. Do not ever have political arguments. That is very bad, an unproductive thing to do. It should not be an argument. It should not be a fight. What you're doing whenever you talk to someone who doesn't share your beliefs is, in fact, an intervention. And so you're basically thinking of this person as an addict, and he's addicted to the wrong drug. He needs to give that drug up and start taking your drug.
I told you he was a pill dispenser.
But you know, that's okay, because the first step you're on, I mean, sure, I'll sell you, I have something that's actually good for you that will make you feel amazing. But, you know, your first step is to get off this junk you're taking, right? And so, you know, basically, you know, at one point in my, you know, vain attempt to coin terms, I came up with the term brown scare, which is like the Red Scare, but our fear of Nazis. You know, there's this like Nazi hunters billboard just down the street from us. Imagine if it was like the 50s and it was like commie hunters. They actually made this great movie called I Married a Communist. It's absolutely worth seeing. Hollywood like had its arm twisted in order to make this anti-communist movie. You know, brown scare didn't really take off because simply people are ignorant today and didn't know that brown is the color of Nazis. But which is, I mean, that's just terrible. Like you're obsessed with Nazis and you don't know anything about Nazis. You know, you know, the Nazi party headquarters was the Brown House, right? And so, you know, basically what happened, you know, I came up with this, you know, I've admitted it, I guess. So I came up with this stupid fucking meme, the red pill, right? Or I stole it from the Wachowskis, rather. And I really just robbed them. And imagine how much they must hate hearing that shit, right? You know, like, dear Wachowski siblings, if you're watching right now, I'm sorry, it was not right. And so basically, you know, I had this idea and I filled this, you know, pill with all these like exotic ingredients, and my pill like cost like, you know, $500, or it was at least 5,000 words. You know, it was a very high quality product and still is. And then of course, you know, what happens to high quality products when you put them on Amazon? They get pirated. And so basically, you know, I mean, it's fairly easy to determine that I was the first that was using this stupid meme, but you know, there's a kind of puzzle that you can't really understand otherwise about this red pill thing, which is it kind of seems to simultaneously appear among pickup artists and Nazis. And then, you know, so the question you have to ask yourself is, who is copying who? Did the pickup artist be like, oh, I like this Nazi thing, I'm going to steal it? Or was it the other way around? And, you know, the reality is they both stole it from me, but I stole it from the Wachowskis. So, you know, basically, if you go out on the street and get just go like, you know, down to the local corner and get a red pill, what you're going to be getting is either a brown pill or a pink pill. That is certainly not a product I can endorse. But you know, I mean, you know the story of Albert Hoffman, right?
Yes, that story I do. So, because still to this day, most of my audience is, more than half of my audience listening to this now and in the future, it will be left-wingers. No matter how many people call me a reactionary or try to smear me in that way, nonetheless, most of the people who listen to this stuff are themselves just kind of on the more anti-woke wing of the left wing. So I'm curious, you probably don't have too many opportunities to address this particular cohort. I'm kind of curious. You know, you wrote
like
on
people on the edge of being like, you know, choppa heads and so forth.
Yeah.
You know, well, Justin, you know, what would be actually kind of cool is if, weren't you or aren't you or don't you have a past as a very, unironic leftist? Can you tell us about the experience of being a junkie?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I'm still happy to identify as a leftist in some ways. As I get older, I get a little bit more socially conservative in certain dimensions. That's partially a life cycle effect. It's a pretty robust phenomenon, actually. But in many ways, my politics haven't really changed. My kind of cultural strategy for being a free person has changed. I've had to update that a lot. It was really, actually, you might be interested to know this, Curtis, that it was a blog post I wrote. The beginning of the end for me and kind of the organized, institutionalized, kind of respectable left was really a blog post that I wrote around 2017. I came to your blog very late, well after its heyday. I just came across people like you and Nick Land. I was an academic. I was holed up just reading only approved academic literatures and, just working in a cave on my academic research. And I came across your blog. I came across Nick Land's blog. And my initial kind of intuition was just like, oh, I thought all these right-wingers were supposed to be stupid, but these are clearly smart people with serious ideas. And I was honestly kind of naively shocked to discover, some real intellectual horsepower on blogs such as yours and Nick Land's. And I wrote a simple blog post in 2017 as an academic, very naive, just, kind of well-behaved academic, saying, hey, there are some people on the radical right who are actually really, really smart. And I actually read a lot of it, guys, and they don't seem that bad. They don't seem half as evil as people say. They're not endorsing any type of obvious harmful racism that I can see. Many, you and Nick Land are both at pains, actually, to reject white nationalism. And I was like, this is actually interesting. Smart people on the extreme right, that's actually a valuable thing to have in a genuine free ecosystem of intellectual culture. So I tried to write this blog post to my
you got a lot of positive feedback.
Well, this was the beginning. Yeah. This was the beginning of the end for me. And so, yeah, I got in a lot of heat for that, and pretty much, make a long story short, that was when I pretty much, it was clear that wasn't allowed to just simply say, hey, this stuff is worth paying attention to. And
I think you'll find generally that if people talk about a Voldemort, they're working for Voldemort.
Right. Well, yeah, so in any event, since you asked, that's when I was pretty much was like, my politics didn't fundamentally change. I've always been interested in a certain kind of radical left vision, which I see as associated with transgression and freedom and, a kind of cultural radicalism.
That's the bait.
Yeah. Well, in any event, it was really then that was the beginning of the end for me. And so since then, I've been trying to occupy this space of because in some ways, I'm being baited by the culture, and I'm being baited by other left-wingers to become a right-winger. The more people call me, oh, Justin, you're a reactionary, you're a racist because you want to talk with people like Curtis Yarvin, in some sense, I can feel psychological attraction to owning that, right? I'm not a racist. I've never have been. I don't have many even right-wing attitudes or opinions, but the sociology of it is pushing me into it. And so I noticed that, and I think, it would be it would be easy and self-serving to just join the right-wing groups. I'd be like, they wouldn't make fun of me or call me these nasty names. Like, right? I could just hang out with them. But then I realized, no, someone needs to hold this ground of an actual radical left that isn't on board with any of this woke bullshit and is actually just interested in truly radically free intellectual life, whether it be on the right wing or the left wing or whatever. And so you asked me to kind of talk about that a little bit. So that's all that's relevant for here. I'm curious from your perspective, because you don't get to address many anti-woke leftists, presumably, just because of how you're perceived. And I think in many ways you're perceived quite unfairly. I'm just curious if you maybe have a particular unique message to the anti-woke left.
Well, I do have a lot of these conversations, but they're typically in private for obvious reasons.
Do you have a lot of friends who are leftists?
One or two. But I don't know. Friends is a strong word. Contacts, perhaps. The thing is, when people use these words, right and left, these are very, very complicated, deep words, and people throw them around. You ever see that? Fake viral video of the chimp with the AK-47. These are words that are full of 200 years of history, and so to use them in a naive way, I think, is somewhat dangerous. Certainly, one of the things that I was noticing back, almost 15 years ago now, that I think is very commonplace is that when people I think when when you talk about, say, your anti-woke leftists, for example, they'll have this wonderful word, the professional managerial class, which is I mean, it's a lot of syllables. You just say the ruling class, or the governing class is a little less pejorative. I was certainly brought up in that class. My father was an American diplomat. I went to Johns Hopkins and Brown and Berkeley. And so, I definitely wouldn't say that, I have any thought of kind of committing treason to this class. Actually, I love these people. They're my people. Culturally, I can hang out with middle Americans, but I'm much more likely to get along with elite blue state ruling class Americans. But one of the things about this ruling class is that I think it's become very much kind of corrupted by power. I think its kind of merits as human beings, its intelligence, its ability to take standardized tests, its cleverness, these things have not dropped at all. But its effectiveness and its wisdom, I think, are much lower than they were in the age of Woodrow fucking Wilson. That's kind of the tragedy that I think needs to be addressed. And so, in a way, when I look at, the anti-woke kind of leftists, in a sense, even to have a political agenda implies that you're part of the ruling class. You're like, this should be done, that should be done. It's like thinking like a king, right? One of the things I really try to do is not to think that this way, and not to think in terms of agenda politics, because you're basically implying that you're a ruler in some sense. Well, you're either in the loop or you're not in the loop. If you're in the loop, you know it. If you're not in the loop, you're basically a sports fan. And so you're kind of having this kind of embarrassing pornographic experience, with respect to power. I really try to avoid that, especially in public. So in a way, it's like my, message to these people is, I think that they've, it's like if you look at your average, get even past the anti-woke leftist. If you look at your average, I don't like to use pejoratives, but I might say a Bernie bro. So if you're a Bernie bro, basically, you've noticed that there's something a little weird about the Democratic Party. And that's maybe it's not, like Hillary Clinton is not like this kind of pure angel of light that you used to maybe think she was. And so in a way, what you've done is kind of taken this kind of first, skeptical step in a sense, but one step is not really a journey. And so, when you basically look at these, when you look at the DNC shitting on Bernie, or you look at the New York Times shitting on Bernie, and you're like, wow, this is very unfair. And then you go and read, the next thing down, in which you trust this institution absolutely. And it's like, once that absolute trust gets questioned, what you'll find is that there's never really a point at which you stop stripping away layers. And, you strip away layers and layers and layers and layers and layers, and sooner, before you know it, you're like debunking the fucking American Revolution, right? And so, which literally happened to me. I mean, I can debunk the American Revolution for you,
Go for it, man.
Do we need that?
If you'd like to, whatever you'd like. I think people would be interested.
Do you want me? Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Obviously, a very complicated series of events. The American Revolution is basically the Vietnam War in the 18th century, with Britain in the position of the U.S. It's actually a civil conflict in between two factions, kind of not just kind of left and right, but Whig and Tory. But these are also religious factions, so it's dissenter or Puritan against Anglican. All these things they're not consistently aligned, but they're sort of generally aligned. And so, the way from an 18th century English perspective to think of America, imagine you're like a Puritan in England. Suppose it's not quite the same thing, but suppose you're a libertarian today. And then you hear about the libertarian paradise has been built in Honduras. You would be very supportive of that paradise. And then, if your, government, sent the Marines to go and wipe out the libertarian paradise in Honduras, you would have a bad reaction to that. And so there's this sort of strange situation arises where, there's this conflict between two segments of English society, and then that conflict is a Cold War at home, but abroad, it's actually a hot war. And that hot war, essentially, the Americans win the war not because they're militarily superior, but because Britain has very little will to fight at any point and loses that will basically completely.
So question, are the founding fathers based or cringe?
Well, there's a lot of you're including a lot of different individuals there.
Well, sort them out then, or the ones,
well,
the ones you have views on.
There's definitely a cringe aspect to Jefferson, but I mean, because Jefferson, becomes this huge fan of the French Revolution. He's like this massive Francophile. He writes these things about the French Revolution where he's like, the Tree of Liberty must be watered with blood. Like, have you ever listened to the lyrics of the Marseillaise?
I'm not sure I recall.
Like the French national anthem is all about like we must drown the country in the blood of the foreigners or whatever the fuck, right? They sing this, so there are aspects of the American Revolution which are, especially the early American Revolution, which are very, very Jacobin-like. So if you look at a figure like Samuel Adams, who kind of disappears from history because he's just a fuck, like he's like who would Samuel Adams be? Bill Ayers is not too far away from Samuel Adams, right? He's really this complete completely unprincipled rabble-rouser.
And they were all torn on the French Revolution. This was a major point of contention.
Well, later. I mean, of course, this is well before the French Revolution, right? Because it's 1775, right?
Sure.
But the French Revolution is this kind of dark imitation of the American Revolution done by these Anglophiles, basically. But what of course we forget is that our glorious Constitution, as established in 1789, is established in a reactionary coup. Not only is the Constitution a reactionary coup basically orchestrated by George Washington and his friends, a very monarchical individual, one of the things you'll notice is basically the first, you probably can name, the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That the period of basically the Congress of the Confederation totally airbrushed out of history. Do you know who America's first president was? It was John Hanson, the president of the Congress. And the results of that system were so disastrous, and the results of that system were identified by people like John Adams literally with democracy. And, basically, like, there was this period of, like, they were just like, this is a shit show. We have to establish basically responsible aristocratic government. We have to replace democracy with oligarchy. And so we're going to run this constitutional convention thing.
But you like that part?
Well, I mean, that part was, that part was an improvement in that situation. Certainly the new republic was very much an aristocratic republic, and it managed to subsist. I mean, people go and watch Hamilton. I mean, God, if they knew the things Hamilton said about democracy. I mean, I'm like, Alex, you got to calm down. I mean, it's a complicated era. You can't reduce the 25 years between 75 and 1800 to like these people were based or cringe. But
sure, of course. I just thought.
If you want to read about this, let's get off this subject, which is very, very technical. And the one thing that I discovered that's absolutely wonderful is, let me tell you, in a form of a parable. Let's say you grew up in Slobovia, imaginary country. And all you go to school, you hear about the glories of the Slobovian Revolution. Of course, that there was a Slobovia before the revolution. Like there was a period of Slobovia was under the heel of an evil monarchy, that, right? And the hero of the Slobovian Revolution, George Washingtonovich, changed all of that. Statues to him are everywhere. Yada 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 yada. So you grew up believing this, and being like a little cult of personality. It's the George Slobovich Day, whatever, right? Washingtonovich. And then one day, some people at this company, Slugel, do something weird for like just weird pothead reasons, which is they're like, we're going to put all books ever written in Slobovian online. And of course, this includes books from before the revolution. Like, it includes all kinds of weird books, right? And stuff that's just like totally not cool. And so one day you're on Slugel and you're browsing, these books, and you're like, for some reason you type in the phrase, true history of the Slavonian Revolution. And the first result, I believe this still works, the first result of this is a book whose title is True History of the Slavonian Revolution. And this book, turns out, was written over 100 years ago. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what these old weirdos 100 years ago thought about the Slavonian Revolution. And you start reading it and you're like, oh, well, that makes so much sense. Oh, well, I never understood that at all. It's like, so here's an example. Anyone here been to Philly? Probably some people. Ever been to Valley Forge?
Never made it out there.
How close is Valley Forge to Philadelphia? It's like 20 miles. You could walk there in a day, right? So how is it that in the winter of, I think, 77 or 78, I think 77, maybe, no, 78, whatever, I'm not one for details. Lord Howe is partying like a monster in Philadelphia. He's occupied Philadelphia. He's gone off and left Burgoyne, who was marching down. Remember the Saratoga where the tide turns, yada, yada. You remember like the third grade history. Burgoyne has this plan. Burgoyne, who's an actual Tory, also a playwright, by the way, has this plan to basically cut the Republic in half by invading from Canada down the Hudson. And basically, Howe, who's the overall commander, ghosts him. Literally, like, basically just ignores the plan. Like, he's like, I didn't even get that letter. Goes and occupies Philadelphia, which is a very civilized town, and just, like, parties like an animal all winter. Meanwhile, in Valley Forge, 20 miles away, George Washington is starving with his troops. Now, it was the 18th century. They didn't usually fight in the winter, but come on. Can't you go out there and be like, hey, once you guys surrender, do you want a hamburger? And like militarily, it simply doesn't make sense. And, essentially what Sidney Fisher, the author of this book, The True History of the American Revolution, points out is that you just can't understand the history of the American Revolution, just like you can't understand the history of Vietnam if you're only understanding it militarily. You have to have an accurate and what I would call Machiavellian, which just means realistic, understanding of what was actually going on. And once you do, you're like, this makes so much sense. So here you're reading this book, it's not even a primary source, and you're just like, this is much more convincing than anything I've ever learned. So that was like, and the great thing about debunking the American Revolution is that, to quote Henry Ford, all of history is bunk. You can debunk basically any conflict in history. It will be written by the winners. It's always more complicated than that. But, you want to go in and rewrite the history of World War II, of the Civil War. You can get away with World War I kind of, you'll get a lot of, that's a very complicated and interesting problem. But the Revolutionary War, what's amazing about debunking the American Revolution is that now in 2020, nobody actually gives a shit about it. You can basically go and be in a bar and be like, man, the British were right. We should still be under King George III. And they'll be like, man, that's cool. It's so cool that you think that.
Well, this is another one of those strange convergences with the radical left-wing critique, right? Because the left also debunks the American Revolution. Oh yeah, we're supposed to admire those people, but really they were property owning, slave owners. That's all bunk. So in a weird way, you're converging with them. And
well, what I would say about if you read you can read Chomsky is a great one for Chomsky is also a pill dispenser. And you'll read it's sort of interesting when you read kind of leftist debunkings, and when I use the word leftist, I kind of mean you've kind of become a ring wraith to some extent, and so you're kind of corrupted by when it's someone like Chomsky, say, would read the American Revolution or any kind of don't even start me on like the 1619 Project. Basically, they're writing their own history that's generally based on actual facts. Although, for the 1619 Project, I think we've gone a little beyond that. But generally based on actual facts. But you're writing this history to be useful. And so you're looking for something. Here is a piece of history that is useful to me, right? And in what way could the story of, the Crimean War be useful to the audiences of today? That is the mindset of these people, and that is just not at all the mindset of the historian.
it comes back to power, doesn't it?
Yes, it comes
exactly
back to being corrupted by power. And so, the mistake that people who have a problem with this system often make is they imitate it. And they say, well, here's my new history of the American Revolution that's like useful for the opposite reason. And that's not, like, that is also doing a grave disservice to the people, these are real people who fought, in this war. And, if you look at any war in history, you should be able to understand and empathize with both sides and feel and understand why both sides thought that they were fighting for what they thought was right. If you can't do that for any conflict, okay, individuals can be psychopaths, but you can't necessarily identify with a crazy individual. But if you can't identify with a group of individuals, it just means you don't understand them.
Well put. And this kind of brings us to your recent idea about the clear pill, in a way, because I see especially your recent writings as it's almost as if you're trying to debunk ideas on the left and the right.
I think so basically the goal of this series, which I'm currently plug writing at the Claremont Institute's American Mind blog, that's kind of the American Mind is, if you don't mind me saying so, kind of the second tier publication of the Claremont Institute. If it was really prestigious, I'd be in the Claremont Review of Books. Maybe I aspire to that, but or maybe I don't. But the American Mind, the editors of that have done a really great job of kind of reaching out to kind of interesting new thinkers. Certainly, probably people more interesting than myself. And and so the goal of this series is basically, I would say if I made, I wrote like a few 100,000 words in that damn blog, so I made a lot of mistakes, but I think if I made any kind of strategic mistakes in kind of how to think about this problem, it was the idea that sort of the cure for the present way of thinking and the way you should be thinking instead were one thing. And I don't think they're one thing, and they can't really be understood as one thing. The thing is that whether you're, a progressive or a Nazi or a constitutional conservative or something else, I suppose there must be something else, I can't think of it, maybe a centrist pragmatist, you basically are kind of attached to a particular way of seeing the current world that I would say contains certain contradictions. And, the way that you want to always carry out in kind of an intervention, whether it's a personal intervention or a political intervention, is to say, let's think about these contradictions and what you think. It's like my example of like democracy versus politics. I'm just asking you a question. I'm like, if you can explain the difference, how democracy can be good and politics can be bad, but they're both the same thing, then you have no need of my products. You must know something I don't. Because I feel like I know the explanation, and it's a pretty darn complicated explanation. But sort of before you make that explanation, basically, you have these kinds of attachments to these causes, these issues, even these individuals, these parties, these cultural groups, which are very, very emotional. It's like being a Lakers fan or something. Probably some Lakers fans in the room. Let's have a moment for Kobe. All right. And yet that there's sort of nothing rational about being a Lakers fan, that it's actually kind of stimulating this sort of political instinct, this thymos, this desire to be relevant and powerful, which ends up in like team spirit and like, just cheering mindlessly in front of the TV. Again, the pornography analogy suggests itself. So in a way, I'm basically like, to kind of take that analogy a little bit further, I'm like, all right, young men, let's face it, you want to get laid. The first thing you have to do, like the way you're thinking of getting laid, is basically, how do I meet the girls on the porn site? That is basically the way you currently think about politics. Okay, so basically the way...
Is this people on the left or the right or both?
Really both. And in order for you to basically have like this kind of normal romantic life like a normal person, the first step is to just give up your porn. So I'm basically going to go through all these different kinds of porn, and I'm going to explain why it's not realistic. And so that's kind of the purpose of the series, in a way, to basically say, okay, as a progressive, this is part 2, I'm not under the illusion that many progressives will read it, but there are a lot of them, so some will. And I'm like, here is kind of what's going on in your head when this stuff excites you. And maybe it's like, if you think a little harder, this is not the thing that you should be into. And then basically the same, and it's a very different story for why constitutional conservatism is hopeless and should give up. And then another one for why white nationalists, Nazis, whatever you want to call them, are hopeless and should give up. And so, you know, when you basically said, hey, you know, all of these things are hopeless, I'm like, imagine, you know, all of these things are hopeless, everyone is trying to change things and nothing is changing. You know, that kind of fits together in a way. And so to detach people from these kind of false, you know, very false kinds of systems, first of all, it's a service, you know, in itself. You know, the way I think about, you know, how should you think about politics or power? Let's say that, okay, you're probably an American. Let's say you move to Costa Rica. You become an expat in Costa Rica. What is your attitude toward Costa Rican elections and the Costa Rican government? Do you consider that this government has no right to rule over you because you did not consent to it? Do you not obey the speed limit? No. You obey the Costa Rican law because you live in Costa Rica. Do you vote in Costa Rican elections? Do you want to vote in Costa Rican elections? Do you like notice it in anything more than a practical way? No, then you're sort of completely detached. And that level of kind of detachment from the desire to change the world is very, very difficult. But paradoxically, I believe it's what's necessary if you're actually going to change the world.
Yeah.
That's seriously fucked up.
No, that's something that you and I definitely agree on. I come from a more kind of left-wing trajectory and you from a more right-wing trajectory. But I think, is it fair to say that you and I probably agree on something like the proposition that true intellectuals, whether they be artists or writers or philosophers or scientists, if what you're really looking for is true disinterested truth-seeking, one must A, detach from power and any dreams or hopes of having power or political efficacy, and B, it's probably going to be in some weird nether region beyond left and right.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, you use these words left and right. These are, you know, very complicated words.
But that's my point, right?
Yeah,
that they're not
exactly.
really good. Yeah.
That you know, I would say that, you know, sort of a more immediate problem when I would say what people normally mean when they say left and right is simply competing cultural groups that are essentially competing, you know, kind of ethnic religions almost in a way. And, you know, one of my strongest beliefs is that if this country ever, you know, functions again or has a government that functions again, or at least maybe can like test people for the coronavirus, I think they're getting around to that. Like, you know, the difference in capacity between this country and China in that is remarkable. I mean, frankly, next week I wouldn't be here, and y'all would be wearing masks. But I wouldn't be here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm, you know, but I think that's the case, and it's very possible that you're going to see the level of state capacity that we have in this country, you know, compared very directly. And if you're ever at a point where basically this country actually works and functions as a country, I think it's going to involve, like, I think one of the most striking things about right versus left is I think one of the main reasons that people support either side is fear of the other. The main reason that people are like feel passionate about being leftists is they have this sense that they're defending this like little dot of light of like civilization against this like horde of ignorant peasants. And, you know, anyone who has grown up in that, you know, that's with that feeling, you know, like knows that sense that, you know, we are the enlightened few and the masses out there are coming with burning pitchforks to like spear us. And this is not I mean, this is in the modern world a ridiculous fear, but historically this is not a ridiculous fear. And so you have this sense of like this kind of very deep and bitter loathing between the upper class and the middle class. Most people call, when they say mean middle class, they say lower middle class. And when they say mean upper class, they say middle class. You know, but basically between the professional managerial classes and anti-woke leftist would put it, you know, the, what would you call the Trump voters? The proles? Would you say proles? Don't say the plurables.
That's a good question. I don't think you could say proles. Proles is much more general, left and right, not just Trump.
You know,
there are Bernie supporters that are proles.
No, there are Bernie supporters that are proles, but they're not cultural proles, or they wouldn't be Bernie supporters. This identification of class stratification with like your bank account is one of the kind of characteristic distortions of leftism. It's all about culture, and like if you've ever been a grad student and like some fellow grad student because his like stipend is low is like, I'm poor. And it's like, no, you're not poor, you're broke. And those are just very different things. And so like status is a much more important determination of class than salary or bank account. And it's definitely a status conflict between, essentially, well, if you'll allow me to use, Marxist terminology, you have the professional managerial class, the proles, and what Marx would call the lumpenproletariat. So there's a sort of alliance of the ruling class and the lumpenproletariat, which is basically
the Democratic Party.
You could call it that. I really hate using these like code words. Like they just become inflammatory. It's like at least you said Democratic Party. If you'd said Democrat Party, that would have meant you were on Fox News, right? My stepfather is a longstanding Hill staffer on the Democratic side. If you want to get him to explode at dinner, just say Democrat Party, which obviously I would never do. But the thing is, my point is that basically, if anything is ever going to actually work in this country, it's basically can only be as an alliance of all three of these classes. You cannot imagine any successful government that is like a government of like one over the others. And so one of the, for me, kind of the big political historical question is, to just take a really grand scope, are we in the late Roman Republic or the late Roman Empire? So if we're in the late Roman Empire, we're absolutely completely fucked. And there are certainly many kind of parallels that you can draw between, for example, the intellectual class that Justin was part of and like the grammarian ruling class of the late Roman Empire. You might have seen this class kind of parodied in a certain Monty Python movie. Really like just completely worthless people, but very well educated. And just useless against the Huns or whatever. Or are we in the late Roman Republic? And that's a very optimistic, most people are like, oh my God, it's like the late Roman Republic. I'm like, that's actually the optimistic perspective. And so one of the things about the Roman Republic, if you know like the kind of kindergarten version of the Roman Republic, you know that the whole history of the Republic is this conflict between first it's the plebeians and patricians, then those categories kind of become obsolete, and it's the optimates versus the populares, right? And which is basically optimates versus populares is Bernie versus Trump. It's as simple as that. And you're like, okay, how does this work out? It's true that they have some civil wars. I don't believe that civil war is possible today, which is another very optimistic perspective, which I will defend. But I just don't believe in violent politics at all, which is very optimistic. But the outcome of this is even more optimistic, which is that it kind of magically ends up with Augustus, the first Roman Empire, previously Octavian. And Augustus is actually a success. And one of the features of the Roman Empire is that this whole conflict between red states and blue states, populares and optimates, whatever, this whole civil conflict, which had been part of the fabric of the Roman Republic for 400 years, something like that, not an expert here, disappears. It's gone. It's never heard of again. So, if you could imagine basically an America in which there's no like red state, blue state conflict, no like race war, like none of this garbage, like, okay, what would you trade for that? I think a lot of people would trade, I think a lot of people would be ready to make, pretty large sacrifices for that. So in a way, Wait,
so what happened exactly? How did that come about?
Augustus. Have you heard of the guy?
Yeah, heard of him, but of course I know everything you're talking about. But for our audience, please remind them of a few of the details.
Okay, well,
a quick rundown, if you will.
maybe in Roman history, like Trump versus Bloomberg is like Marius versus Sulla. So essentially, what happens is one side wins the civil war, but the side that wins the civil war is not really, it's like Caesar, who's the one who actually wins, and Caesar and Augustus have much the same plans. Caesar just wasn't really careful about his personal security. But they were basically they both had the style of unifiers. And by the way, they didn't claim to have abolished the republic at all. They claimed to have restored and fixed the republic. They were just the first citizen of the republic, and everything was voted on by the Senate. Of course, the Senate was a rubber stamp, but they never restored the title of Rex, the title of king, which was an old Roman, title. The last kings of Rome were driven out in like 500 something BC, right? So they're like, we have saved the republic, but we've created in practice is effectively a monarchy. So in some ways, Augustus is actually more like FDR than you might think. And so, let's imagine like, Bloomberg doing a New Deal, like it's a ridiculous, it could never happen. But, the thing is that, Augustus's Rome, like FDR's Washington, was a startup nation, because it was under the absolute control of this guy, Augustus, who was absolutely competent and completely effective and had no interest in continuing any of these squabbles. So there's this great story. It's about Caesar rather than Augustus. I think it sort of expresses the kind of attitude that's kind of necessary in creating kind of anything new and awesome. Of course, nothing happens without not violence but force. So, Caesar's force comes from the popularis. He is originally a man of the popularis. So, he fights the civil war, and he's fighting against Cato. And Cato is like, everyone super respects Cato. Cato is like, imagine like some like really old line, Democrat who like really believes in the process and really believes in the republic. It's not cynical at all. This is a person who is just completely believes in the system. That's Cato. Cato gets beat. He does this very Roman thing. He commits seppuku, actually. He does this like Japanese suicide ritual, and actually cuts his belly with his sword and like tears his own intestines out. And his slaves tries to push them back in, and he tears them back out again. Super gory, and would make a great movie. So Cato is beaten, right? But Caesar basically captures Cato's headquarters, and in Cato's tent, there's a big chest, and the chest is full of letters from his supporters in Rome. So one of the things that about these conflicts in Roman history, and you see this extensively in kind of the preludes to that final civil war between like Marius and Sulla, is something called proscription. And that idea of proscription is when you win one of these contests, you basically are like, okay, who are the wealthy supporters of the other side? We are going to kill them and take their property and give it to our friends.
I think Sanders supporters are getting excited listening to you.
Yeah, right. So, imagine if, like, Trump wins the election, he throws Soros in jail, he takes all of Soros's money and redistributes it to, like, magatards, right? If you'll excuse my French. This would be a very aggressive action by Donald Trump, but that was absolutely normal in Roman politics. So basically, completely normal, expected thing to do. So, Caesar's guys basically find this chest, and they're like, holy shit, you won't believe what we found. Because we're like, this is the mother lode. Because, of course, a lot of these motherfuckers would write letters to both sides. They'd be like, Cato, man, you're the one. You're really strong. You have these Roman values. And then they'd be like, Caesar, oh, my God, you're so Caesar, right? So they'd write the same letter to both sides. So, these are the people that you really want to find because these are not your guys, right? You can't trust them. And you really want to kill them and take their property. And then there are the guys who are just against you. And you definitely want to kill them and take their property. So, Caesar's guys are super hot to trot, right? And they're like, what do we do? How do we start working through this? Caesar's like, okay, take the chest of letters, put it on a bunch of logs, pour olive oil on it, and set it on fire. These guys are like, what? Caesar's like, you don't get it. Like, motherfuckers, we won. We won. they're all our guys now. And so, you know, the that sense of basically they're all our guys now, you know, is basically essential to anything that actually works. And so, you know, that's obviously, you know, very far from this vision of, you know, peasants with red hot pitchforks, you know, visiting, the University of Southampton, I guess, to, basically toss you on their devilish burning tines. It's the absolute opposite, but it also doesn't mean, you know, we must, you know, hound and harry the peasants and, basically go full Spartan on them. And, you know, which is really, I think, in many ways the attitude of not necessarily the, you know, there's definitely, I don't know, when I say go full Spartan, one of the things the Spartan elite like to do is basically if you were like a young Spartan, like, you know, ruling class, like, you know, like Chapo dude or whatever, you would basically imagine if like Chapo dudes like had like secret Chapo parties where they went in and like just found like drove out to the suburbs and found like some like MAGA dude with like a MAGA sign in front of his hat and just like burned his house down and killed him. That would be like the Spartan way of being a ruling class, right? And, you know, I think there's people that like to do that, and I'm very confident of it. And so that, like, you know, that mentality is a very dark and evil mentality, which in a way very much parallels the mentality of the average school shooter today. You know, and I can say average school shooter because, frankly, there's a lot of them. And so you kind of see this kind of, you know, like these pathological phenomena emerging out of this conflict. And I think it's a very pathological conflict. And I'm certainly, I mean, you know, these are very, you know, banal sentiments. Everybody's going to agree with that. Nobody's going to agree with basically how you get out of it. But
Right. No, that's interesting. So what I want to do in just a minute is open it up to audience questions shortly. But if you have just a little bit more steam, Curtis, I thought I'd maybe ask you one or two more questions.
sure.
And specifically, I'd like to ask you about some of the bigger ideas in your writings.
I don't think there's any really big ideas. I don't
Well-
I don't really have any ideas at all, actually.
Well, I can ask you, and then you can answer
Sure.
that. You can, if that's how you'd like to answer, you're more than welcome to. Because we've talked a lot up until now about debunking various ideas on the left and the right, and I think you're very good at that. But if one reads your blog, Unqualified Reservations, closely, and there's a lot of it to read, but I have read most of it, one does see certain big ideas, more positive ideas, I think, more positive visions.
I disagree very strongly. I think that the really important content there is purely negative. It's basically, you know, the most important thing is an absence of belief. You know, there are probably some positive ideas behind it, but you should really focus on the absence of belief.
Well, let me give you an example. And while I'm asking you just one or two questions about what I see as the bigger positive ideas in your writing, the audience, you all should be thinking about good questions to ask if you're interested to ask any. And I'll turn to you in just a minute. So one would be formalism, for instance.
Right.
This is how you describe your political philosophy in one word. I think it's kind of the most efficient way you describe your political philosophy. And if I understand it correctly, I'll give people just a very quick and dirty summary of the idea, and you can clarify if you need to or what have you. But then I want to ask you about it. The way I understand it is pretty much Curtis seems to be of the viewpoint that one of the biggest problems in especially American politics today is a bad mapping between the actual distribution of power and how power is actually acknowledged or formalized or labeled. That where power actually exists is distributed and messy, and no one's really honest about it. Whereas the idea of formalism is that if we could simply account rigorously for who has power and where power is had, and that's done formally in a way that's rigorous, that this would solve a lot of problems, perhaps.
Sure. So you know, yeah. I think that's pretty much mostly right. I would recommend if anyone out there likes books. One of the great, possibly the greatest work of political science in the 20th century is a book called The Machiavellians by a writer named James Burnham. It's not his most famous book, but it's his best book. Burnham was, he was originally a Trotskyist, of all things, and like many Trotskyists, you know, he found himself a right-winger. Maybe the world moved under him. Maybe he moved, maybe both. He wrote this wonderful book called The Machiavellians, which is a summary of what's called the, in English, of what's called sometimes called the Italian School of Political Science, which is over 100 years old, and its classic, its great figure really a guy on a par with Newton and Darwin in my mind is a guy named Gaetano Mosca, who's completely unknown. He wrote a book called Elements of Political Science, which somehow got the English title of Theory of the Ruling Class. I think of it as Elements of Political Science because that's actually its title. If you just read Burnham's very incisive summary of it, that basically gives the basic idea that Justin was just trying to express, which is essentially that many, in fact, most political systems in the real world have this divergence between formal power, like how the system is actually supposed to work, and objective power as in terms of who's actually in charge. It's like, a very simple way to think about this is like Elizabeth II. So Elizabeth II has, kind of nominal authority. Actually, she can veto legislation. Most people didn't know this. She has the same power as the president. She can veto an act of parliament. The last time an English monarch vetoed an act of parliament, 1707, I think, under Queen Anne. So in theory she has it, just like in theory Donald Trump can tell the Justice Department who to prosecute and who not to prosecute, but in practice that would be taken as a gross violation. And so the reality of power and the formal, the formal legal reality of power and the objective reality of power have become diverged. And that's very, very common historically. The Emperor of Japan has not been the Emperor of Japan for over 1,000 years.
I think something that might not be clear to people or not obvious to people is why is this such a problem, and why would formalizing that distribution of power be so good?
When you formalize the distribution of power, because basically one of the main benefit for the powerful of this divergence between appearance and reality is that when the reality is powerless and basically symbolic, when the appearance is powerless and basically symbolic, then the reality is unaccountable because no one thinks of it as an organ with power. And this is especially effective if it's decentralized. So like any oligarchy. So there's a great example in 7th century France of the Merovingian and the Carolingian kings. So the Merovingian dynasty are like these long-haired barbarians who conquer Roman Gaul and establish themselves as king. And of course, originally they're badasses. They're like Germanic warriors, right? But over time, they come to develop a taste for civilization, and they basically turn into the French word. I can't speak French. Is roi fainéant, which means do nothing king, literally. So these kings who are like Clovis the fourth or fifth or sixth or whatever become these like Elizabeth II. Unusually, however, the force holding real power is the mayor of a figure called the mayor of the palace, who was originally just a permanent bureaucrat. He's basically the deep state of Merovingian France. But the deep state of Merovingian France is actually a monarchy. Imagine if the deep state had a boss. There was like a chief deep state person. Like that would be the mayor of the palace, right? And so eventually the mayor of the palace is just like, fuck it, I'm running things. And literally, what does the king do? Literally, I bring him out in an ox cart every 6 months to read a speech I wrote. Fuck this, it's over, it's done, he's not the king anymore. I'm the king. And this is the origin of Charlemagne. You've heard of Charlemagne? Like there's a rapper, I think, with that. This is the origin of Charlemagne, right? And so basically here you see actually a real monarchy and a shadow monarchy at the same time. And the great thing about being the mayor of the palace is it's like being the deep state. You're completely unaccountable, which is absolutely great if you're you, right? And so in a sense, essentially, you might remember originally that I said that this country was not a democracy and I didn't think it should be a democracy. You have this very, very, these very unaccountable permanent structures, some of which are in the formal government and some of which are outside of it. So here's another example. Suppose you're like, okay, there's this thing called the mainstream media. You might have heard that term on like Breitbart or something. To someone who's part of it, of course, you wouldn't say that. You would just say the press, the free press, right? And when you look at this free press, you're like, okay, I can identify that certain institutions are part of the press and certain are not. Like, what does it mean to be a journalist? Is that a formal title? Do I get it on my airline tickets? Do I say, J instead of Mr. as a journalist? No, but yet there's some sense in which it's official. There's some sense in which the New York Times is official. Well, without really changing the way the New York Times operates, you could say we're going to take the Times, and the Post, and we're going to call them part of the federal government. They're not going to change the way they operate at all. We're just going to call them the Department of Information, and we're going to call them paper number 1 and paper number 2. And then they're going to, instead of thinking themselves as public servants, they'll be civil servants, have exactly the same immunity, have exactly the same free access to government secrets, which they then sell to the public. And you're like, not only is the Department of Information clearly a real part of the government, it's actually the most powerful part of the government. It's actually completely unaccountable. And you know what else is cool about the New York Times? I was having this discussion confidentially with a journalist who should not be named. Only talk to journalists off the record. I was like, there's a difference between Jeff Bezos' relationship to the Washington Post and the Sulzberger's family's relationship to the New York Times. Because Arthur Sulzberger, Punch, or whatever the fuck they call him, is actually part of the news desk. If he tells the journalists, hey, or the editors, hey, I think you need to steer things in this direction or that direction, they'll listen to him. If Jeff Bezos tells the Post, oh, I don't think I really like how you're covering this story, you know what the answer of any self-respecting Post journalist is going to be? I quit. I'm going to go work for the New York Times, which is a real newspaper. And do you know how the New York Times is governed?
How?
It's an absolute hereditary monarchy.
Based.
Yes.
All right.
Definitely not cringe.
So the last question I want to ask you before we turn it off to this very patient audience that is sat
Thank you for sitting through all this ridiculous bullshit.
quietly and wrapped. Let's talk about SovCorps real quick. This is, I think, one of your other big ideas that you're kind of known for.
Sort of an old big idea. I mean, both formalism and SovCorps are kind of like, as I was writing this piece, I was, as I was writing this blog, of course, I'm thinking at the same time, and so some of my kinds of perspectives, I mean, I don't disagree with these ideas at all, I just emphasize them a little differently.
Sure. Well, the idea of the SovCorp, which many people will, remember if they've read your blog, is, there you go, take that shot. Oh, sip on the whiskey. All right, I thought you were going to throw it back. Here,
We're almost done
join
here.
you. Might as well, yeah.
We're almost done here. No, we have to take shots.
You got to get loose for audience questions.
All right,
that's
all
for
right,
sure.
all right.
Cheers.
Skål.
The idea of SovCorps, as I understand it, you paint a portrait of a possible political world in which there's a very large number of relatively small governance structures or polities.
Mm-hmm.
This is sometimes known as patchwork. This is an idea that a lot of people are actually quite interested in right now.
This is an idea that a lot of people have separately had independently.
Of course, yeah. I'm not saying you invented it or anything, but in your vision of patchwork, there would be a kind of governance structure or a kind of polity in which pretty much the government owns a piece of territory and runs it like a business.
This is the way it already works, actually. It's just done really badly.
Right. So it's closely related to formalism.
So, if you imagine, one of the things, I strongly believe in is whenever you're talking about a group or an entity, you should always use the term that group uses to refer to itself. So in Washington, if you're writing about the U.S. government, you will say either USG or the USG. Either is acceptable. Actually, coincidentally, there's a company called USG, United States Gypsum, which is like traded on the stock exchange, right? But they're not the same thing. But, in essence, what you're looking at when you're looking at a government is a corporation that owns a country. It just is. It's the same thing. It's just, it sort of has this really strange governance structure. If you can imagine like a corporation governed the way the United States is governed. Imagine if Apple had like a Congress and a Supreme Court. Maybe it had like separation of powers. So like, Congress would be like marketing and like the executive branch would be like engineering, and it'd be like, you have to separate marketing and engineering. And then the Supreme Court is like HR, you could imagine, you could imagine doing it that way. But I don't think it would make very good phones. One of the things that's most remarkable about the way people think about politics and democracy today is, probably most people here got here in a car. Did you get here in a car? Well, who built that car? I'm like, well, there's a very simple answer. That car was built by a monarchy because it was built by a corporation with a CEO who is essentially in absolute control of that organization, yet also accountable. I'll get to that in a second. But, you drive a car. It was built by a monarchy. You eat at a restaurant. It's a monarchy. Anyone ever seen Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares? Amazing show. It's not about cooking. It's about management. It's about power and about government. I realize that Gordon Ramsay's not eligible to be president, but I mean, if you want a reality show president, imagine Gordon Ramsay going through like the State Department's fridge. He'd be like, I see you sent $500 million to this guy. Wow. Who is this person? What is this doing in this drawer? You could imagine that very easily, right? And if you've seen the show, it's a very good show. The British one is better. But that's very easy to, like, that once you start seeing that equivalence, you're like, okay, I got here in a car built by a monarchy. I ate at a restaurant built by a monarchy. I stayed at a hotel run by a monarchy. I went and sent a letter at a post office. And so there's this kind of massive contrast that everyone sees, right? And you could even get, anyone will be like, oh yeah, a benevolent dictatorship is the best, form of government, but how do you make sure it stays benevolent? As though this is like a question that can't be answered. And I'm like, no, actually, I think that's a very interesting question. Maybe he does have an answer. And so, the concept of...
And the answer is to make them compete?
The answer is, I would say, as generally as possible. If you look at what, your car, your restaurant, and, Elizabethan England have in common, they are all what I would call accountable monarchies. And so, let's take Augustus. We talked about Augustus earlier. Like, Augustus saved Rome. Everyone in Augustus's Rome is just like, oh my God, I'm so glad that was over. I could never even imagine it being over, and yet it's over. This is wonderful. That is the unanimous sentiment. Augustus is, a supremely competent dude. He does fine. Augustus' successor is Tiberius. There's some questions about Tiberius. He has this weird episode with Sejanus. After Tiberius comes a name that you might recognize, Caligula. After Caligula, you get Claudius, who's kind of a nerdy weirdo. After Claudius, you get Nero, right? And so, in a way, when people think about monarchies, that wasn't quite a hereditary monarchy. It had weird things going on. Hereditary monarchies can have this just like monstrous failure mode where it's like Henry VI. Shakespeare wrote 2 Henry VI plays. You had an incompetent king of England. It resulted in the Wars of the Roses, massive devastation, right? And so, and anyone, even if you're like Steve Jobs, you're like this amazing like king of Apple, right? Apple succeeded because Apple is sort of more truly a monarchy than any other corporation. And because of that, it made the most amazing phones. And they've kept that up even without Jobs. Suppose Steve Jobs, instead of getting a pancreatic tumor, gets a brain tumor. He goes nuts. He's like, no, your next phone has to be big. It has to be big. I want a big phone, right? He goes nuts, and who can say no? No, we can't sell a phone that is the size of an easel, right? And no one has the right or the power to tell him that, and so he has to be accountable. And so, in a way, one of the kind of tragedies of the modern democratic form of government, one thing most people don't know about the title of president. I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. I hope I'm not wrong. But even if I'm wrong, it's a good story. President is actually originally, it's used as a corporate title and a political title. You imagine that the corporate title is like a copy of the political title. Not so. It was actually a corporate title before it was a political title. And one of the things about the Puritans who basically founded the Republic, they were very experienced in forming like trading companies and so forth. And so the idea of kind of the Congress being, in a way, kind of like a board of directors, in a sense, to whom the CEO is accountable, is kind of, it's like almost there in the Constitution, but it's not there. So we have this shit show, right? But it's kind of almost there. And, you know, the modern corporation hadn't really even been invented by the time, you know, it's sort of, there were these kind of prototypical things, but, you know, you get the real modern joint stock corporation in the 19th century. And I'm so crazy, I actually think the Industrial Revolution was actually the corporate revolution. Very unpopular belief, right? You know, because basically people learned how to operate in these these structures that were like states, essentially, but they were like secondary states under the main states. And it was like, you look at like Amazon, Amazon's like 500,000 employees or something. You know, that's enough to govern the world, right? And that, you know, is accountable to this one guy, Jeff Bezos. And like, it's not just, he's not just a figurehead, like it really, you know, Bezos is like a jobs-like figure in some ways, right? And so that's kind of the ideal of monarchy. And then, of course, you have Caligula and Nero.
So in your model then, in an ideal world, the United States government would be, the distribution of power would be fully formalized. We would turn it into essentially a joint stock corporation in which the power holders would be shareholders in a corporation. And then that corporation would run the country or run the territory for profit.
There's a crucial mistake that you're making, I think. And this is this is why I don't really use that terminology anymore, because, you know, what you're saying is right, but it's also wrong.
Okay.
You know, the way in which it's wrong is it has this kind of mechanical, it's sort of almost, I think a lot of, you know, the only reason I would recommend not reading my old blog is that I think a lot of the material in it in some ways was kind of designed to be as kind of harsh and off-putting and difficult as possible, you know, which was just kind of...
One notices that right away, I think.
Which was, yeah, it was just kind of juvenile of me.
It's what makes it fun, though. And I, for one, would definitely recommend you read Curtis's blog.
Fine. You know, part of the problem is that this is my free content, and I want to write a book that's going to compete with this.
Excellent.
It's just a sheer matter of the grift, Justin.
I get it. I get it.
You know, like real artist grift. You know, Samuel Johnson. You can see I shouldn't have knocked back that shot. Samuel Johnson.
We definitely should have.
Samuel Johnson, you know, said, you know, only a fool writes for anything but money. In that case, I'm definitely a fool. So yeah, so in a way, the way you stated it is stated in a relatively, in a way that's sort of both off-putting and wrong. And one of the things most people, like, even people who are like, you know, like say business school professors, and I do know one or two business school, well, at least one business school professor, and even people who are business school professors are basically in some ways think of the way corporate governance works in the wrong way, because they're like, the shareholders govern the corporation. The reality is, having actually been the CEO of a motherfucking fucking corporation, the reality is the CEO is completely in charge, but completely accountable to the board. I was my own board, so it was a little different. But if you actually have a board, if you're so unlucky as to actually have a board, you're accountable to that board. But the thing is, if the board gets involved in the governance of your corporation, something is completely fucked. And if the shareholders get involved, something is profoundly fucked, and your corporation is almost certain not to survive. Or like, either your corporation is not going to survive, or you are not going to survive. And that is the only reason why shareholders would get involved in like shareholder democracy. And so when you look at this structure of like the shareholders and the board, it's not a management structure. It's not a power structure. It's not actually micromanaging. Like the board of Apple was never second guessing Steve Jobs' decisions.
Right.
It fired Steve Jobs once. It was probably prepared to fire him again. And it would have fired him if he'd gotten a brain tumor and started selling phones the size of a fucking window. You know, but it didn't need to do that. And it shouldn't have done that. And so Steve Jobs was accountable. And the thing is, the mechanism he was accountable to, because it was not actually governing the company, was not actually corrupted by power, because it was not wielding power. It was just a backup safety mechanism. And so the accountability structure in an accountable monarchy is a backup system. It's not actually sort of in power. It's just like, oh yeah, if things get fucked up, we'll fix it. Make sense?
Makes sense to me. What do you all think? Ladies and gentlemen, Curtis Yarvin.
All right.
Man,
Thank you for coming by and experiencing this bullshit.
thank you, Curtis. You know, they say the masses don't. They say the masses have short attention spans. That they don't want long form intellectual content.
How long was that?
I don't even know. I went into a wormhole. Was that 3 hours? How long was it? 2. Okay, no, two's not that bad.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I hope you enjoyed that. Now let's make this a raucous, Vox Populi segment. I want to now invite people to ask questions.
Do I need to get my weapons out of the car?
No, I don't think there are any. I don't think there are gonna be any pitchforks here. I think we're good. But challenging questions. People should feel free. Don't hold back. Don't be shy.
Anything nonviolent is fair game.
Anything nonviolent is fair game. So raise your hand. Go first. Just shout it out. I think this isn't going to reach to everyone.
You sat in the middle of the front row so you could do that.
We will repeat your question when we answer it.
Okay, great.
Curtis will.
Let me say, first of all, thank you, Justin, for organizing this. I think that the only way to have Moldbug on as a guest speaker is to be called leftist at this point. But I want to say, Moldbug, thank you for coming and expressing yourself. You spoke about distance. You spoke about people who are gonna get their houses burned down with Molotov cocktails if they say the wrong thing, and you identify with this group of people.
Nobody knows where I live.
Thankfully. But how does people, and I had the chance to speak to a few of these leftists here, they ask, who is Moldbug? And I say, Moldbug is the last stand before you get your house burned down, even though you probably will get your house burned down. But
Thank you for that.
Wow.
He's the last guy who's like, okay, well, somebody might defend him to say, he's not that bad, which is how Justin described you as not that bad, which I thought was a cop-out, because whatever.
Justin, frankly,
Yeah.
Justin is still growing.
I think Justin is doing great things. But my pro with Justin is like, why would you describe something that's not that bad? Like this, So how would you describe it before that bad? That's my question.
Can I answer that? Even though it's addressed to Justin.
No, it's for you. It's for you.
How do you describe the person beyond Moldbug? That's the question. Is he the X factor? Who?
The thing is, you have this dimensional perception, and in a way, what I kind of want to tell you is you need to abandon your linear Western way of thinking.
Wait, him or me?
Well, everyone.
Okay.
But you definitely need to abandon your your linear Western way of thinking. Let me give you a brief example of that. I said earlier that it's very frightening to talk about World War II. Let me talk about World War II for a second. I was in a
That's such a Moldbug thing to say.
I was in about a couple of years ago. I was in a car, went to visit some right-wing personality whose name I won't mention, in a car with another right-wing personality whose name I won't mention. And on the way back, we fell to talking about World War II. I said to this guy, I was like, in Nuremberg, the Nazis were charged with 2 great crimes. One of them was plotting to take over the world, and the other one was the mass murder of the, actually, people didn't really think of it in ethnic terms at that time, so they just thought crimes against humanity. The idea of the Holocaust, is sort of from the 1970s, and it was like, actually, don't get me wrong, it was like a realization of the truth in the 1970s, but the truth that actually the Holocaust was Jew-specific was actually politically incorrect in the 1940s. If you don't believe me, you can go on YouTube and watch a wonderful little film called Hitler Lives, 1945, directed by Don Siegel, who later directed Dirty Harry. Script by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. It is an anti-German propaganda film. It is fucking weird.
Dude, that's the biggest red pill of the night right there.
It is fucking
Holy
weird.
Shit.
It is just
I don't even know what you're talking about, but I'll look into it.
It is just weird. It shows you horrors of the Nazis that are absolutely true and genuine, and it does not use the word Jew ever.
So you're saying in the 40s, it was politically incorrect to say that the Holocaust was all about the Jews?
That's correct. The word Holocaust was not used at that time. Far from, and so in a way, like
We need a fact checker.
part of like modern, Nazi propaganda is basically, the Holocaust is World War II propaganda. And I'm like, no one who had any idea of World War II propaganda would ever say that. You have no clue. So I'm in this car, basically, I'm like, I know more about Hitler than you've forgotten. I've forgotten more about Hitler than you know. Sorry. Another too many shots. So I'm talking to this person who, as you might say, had gone too far, and I'm basically like, at Nuremberg, the Nazis were charged with 2 great crimes. One of them was plotting to take over the world, and the other one was crimes against humanity. And they were absolutely guilty of one of these crimes and absolutely not guilty of the others. And this guy's like, you're absolutely right. They were definitely plotting to take over the world, but the Holocaust is totally fake. I'm like, dude, you got it absolutely flipped around. And there's this great Wikipedia page, which is called like Nazi Offensive Plans Controversy. And it was like sort of devoted to the question, which of course, historians have studied the Nazis like ad infinitum, right? They know more about the Nazis than like a proctologist like knows about your colon, right? Like we know we have all their files except for the ones they burned. We know everything about the Nazis, and basically everything we know, everything you learn in school about the Nazis is absolutely true. Like historians have basically a perfect understanding of the Third Reich, contrary to Nazi belief. In this perfect understanding, which of course is faithfully reflected in Wikipedia, you can go to Wikipedia. I believe the title is like Nazi Offensive Plan Strategy or whatever. And you can this page is devoted to like, what was the Nazi plan to take over the world? And the evidence for the Nazi plan to take over the world on this page is such as like, Hitler built really big buildings, which is characteristics of people who wanted to take over the world, right? And so the thing is, what you'll notice the pattern is here is the truth is not useful to anyone. And what Nazis do is they're like, if it was really true that the Holocaust never happened, then everything would be really, really simple. I'm like, that's true. It would be really, really simple. Unfortunately, it's actually really, really complicated. And yet, the whole story of these events that we sort of received history is really just not a true story, but it's not a false story in the obvious ways. It's not a false story in obviously useful ways. If you're like, any historian who knows the period will agree that, Hitler's fondest lifelong dream was to make an alliance with Great Britain. This is just a historical fact. No historian disagrees about this. And yet, it's not useful. It's not like it doesn't change the story of World War II in a way that's like, useful to like, oh, we got to establish the white ethno-state or some fucking shit, right? And so, you have this situation where you don't really expect that all perspectives on this enormous event that are held today, all perspectives on World War II that are commonly held today, from progressive to Nazi, are just not really well correlated with reality.
Right. It's like what the Nazis actually did was bad enough, but then they have to also create these other layers of even more extreme evil. Like, not only did they kill all these people, but they're also trying to take over the whole world.
Well, no,
and then it has this weird effect of like discrediting and creating these spaces for conspiracy theories.
If you go and watch Hitler Lives, basically the Nazi plan to take over the world is the prominent feature of World War II propaganda. Like, that's what actually people thought when they were fighting this war. We are fighting a war to keep Hitler from taking over the world.
Because American voters wouldn't really give a shit about like actually what they were doing.
Hitler was certainly interested in taking over Eastern Europe. I'll give you that. But like, it's a long way from there to the Rio Grande. And actually at the time, at the fall of France, like if you read like the New York Times, like American mainstream thinking around the time of the fall of France is like, Hitler has conquered France. Therefore, France has colonies in Africa. And therefore, and it's only a little hop from Africa to Brazil. And then once you're in Brazil, the Rio Grande, right? And like you'll go back in history and you'll find people like revered people like George Marshall selling this theory, right? And you're just like this war is fought both sides. Like, I'm not telling you the Nazis aren't on crack. The Nazis are definitely on crack. The Soviets are also on crack, right? Everybody's on crack. And, you know, the sort of the true history of these events is so dark and so useless and so grim and so weird that nobody wants it. And so in a way, if you're basically looking for useful history, you're not going to find that reality. And yet in some ways that reality is actually more useful than these like sort of just so stories.
But then people want to produce these moral tales to make it useful for power. And then what ends up happening is that becomes grist for the mill of actually racist, fascist conspiracy theorists who point to this sort of thing as evidence that it's all a lie.
Well, you know,
the Holocaust didn't really happen.
And what's happening is that these people are basically, you know, I sort of warned people earlier, you know, the thing that's really important not to do is to basically inhabit their caricature of you. And that's exactly what you're doing if you're a Nazi or a white nationalist. I understand that you believe that I'm speaking directly to you now. I understand that you're not in this room. I understand that you believe that you're being like uncompromising and like super metal. Okay, but they're actually like, that is a very one-dimensional way to think, and there are actually much more metal ways to be super metal. And that's what you're doing is basically, look, like, honestly, you know, one thing I was saying to a recent, you know, college graduate earlier, I was like, you know, I graduated from Brown in 1992. I think the level of like, you know, political energy that people get these days in an average American high school, even a red state high school, is about the same level that we got at Brown in 1992. Brown in 2020, I can't even tell you. So people basically are hearing this nonstop, this like strange, these contradictory things. Race exists, race does not exist. You know, race is all important. There's no such thing as race. You know, we need to welcome immigrants, but we're not replacing the population. You know, just like this strange contradictions. You're just like, this is super weird. Like, and like you get this stuff and it doesn't even make sense. And you're like, okay, what's the opposite of this? And that mentality that says, what's the opposite of this? You basically imagine you're like in some session with your like guidance counselor, or you've said a bad word or something, your guidance counselor is talking to you and you're just like, I hate this person with every bone in my body. What is the opposite of this person? Well, guess what? This person has already told you what the opposite of this person is. It's fucking Hitler. So you're like, how, baby? You know, and the thing is, you have actually failed.
That's so true.
You have actually failed to exit that frame.
That's
you are
so true.
still basically the captive of this guidance counselor. And until you basically are like, no, actually what this person thinks just doesn't matter and isn't related to anything. And actually, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. Let me find out something, right? And instead, it's so much easier to say the Holocaust didn't happen. Well, you know, I have news for you. The Holocaust did happen. And if you disagree with me, I'm happy to come on your podcast and tell you why you're wrong. And,
awesome.
And so like this complicated, real, ugly history is not useful to anyone. And yet when you hear it and see it, it rings true in a way that these like fake cardboard things don't. So it's actually in a way more useful.
Right on. Right on. Hell yeah. So, all right.
Is that a good enough answer? It was long, but so was your question.
Yeah, I think you're brilliant. I love your long answers, but I'm going to hold you to short answers this time so we can get I want lots of people to be able to talk, express ideas, whatever, raise questions. Who's next? I think I saw a hand over here. Yeah. Oh, do you mind if I? Everyone will get a turn. Go ahead.
I have a question about what you were saying about monarchy. So thank you for coming today. By the way, I'm a fan. So if inherent to the concept of monarchy is this idea of a shadow monarchy, right? I mean, you agree with that, right?
What do you mean by shadow monarchy exactly?
I mean as in like a string puller, right?
Yes, so the string pullers of today, I guess unless you count the Salzburgers, you know, aren't really monarchs so much. You know, the system, you know, may have been established by sort of more centralized powers, but, you know, if the New York Times disappeared, everything would be fine. And so the kind of decentralized nature of the string pullers is what makes it very hard to think about them.
People want to say the New York Times is the primary.
Yes, and in fact, if the New York Times disappeared, nothing would change.
Okay, and if you agree with the idea that like a true democracy doesn't exist, I obviously agree with that as well. There are always string pullers. Like, how does that intersect with your idea of what you were saying earlier about like you know, we should be very wary of using the left-right dichotomy, right? Because they, in one way, they're kind of meaningless, and in another, it's like, I think you said a better way to see left and right would be through, like, ethnic groups. How do those two, I guess what I'm saying is, who makes up the monarch and who makes up the shadow monarch?
I would say broadly, you know, yeah, okay. Broadly, but shortly. The tradition of explicit monarchy, as represented in, say, Elizabeth I, of whom we still have very fond sort of cultural memories, is Elizabeth inherited this world in which there was this conflict between Catholics and Protestants, which was not at all like our present conflict, and there were also different kinds of Protestants, and she absolutely determined to be the queen of everyone. And that nature of kind of sort of formal monarchy, of like exposed monarchy, because I don't think there can really be a shadow monarchy today. I don't think there are any kind of shadow secret powers that are centralized in any sense. You know, whether it's, you know, Davos or Bilderberg or whatever, you know, or even George Soros. I don't think that really exists. But when you have a formal, explicit monarchy that says, I am in charge and I am responsible for that. You might even, you know, Xi Jinping, who has many faults today in China, you know, is still, well, let's see how we do with this virus. That monarchy has to express that very, very strong sense of unity. And so the sense in which the monarch is, you know, it's like Queen Mary, before Elizabeth, her sister, tried to be the queen of the Catholics over everyone else. That didn't work out very well. And so that sense of unity is really, really important. Hopefully that answers some of your question.
Very good and short. Well done, Curtis. Shout out to Queen Mary. You want to call someone?
Yes. Yeah. On the same topic, I'm wondering, you're talking about the people who hold the monarch accountable.
Yeah.
What prevents them from abusing their power?
Excellent question. So, you know, the thing is that what prevents them from abusing their power is that they essentially, when you look at, I mean, you can look at modern corporate governance and basically see how this works. So the board of Apple could very easily abuse its power. But the thing is, the board of Apple never gets a taste of power. Like, it's basically like someone who has, you know, if you're not a junkie, like I have a bottle of like, you know, hydrocodone that I got for some prescription, like some surgery, like 6 years ago in my, you know, cabinet somewhere. If I was a junkie, that shit would be gone, you know? and so in a way, basically, the reason why you can trust an accountability structure not to be corrupted by power is very simple, that it almost never sees power.
But also you don't really know, when you do have power, you probably don't necessarily know that you have it. Because it's like how do you know, it's like an infinitum.
Sure, yeah, it's like the who watches the Watchmen, you know, question. And the answer is basically the people who watch the Watchmen need to have full-time lives doing something else.
Who else? You want to call in someone? I got it. Yeah. All right, Nick.
Yeah, so this is a question for both of you. I'm very curious about patchwork, but I'd like to bring it down a little bit from the theory into something more real. So it's an open question to both of you. If you were CEO king of your own patchwork, city, colony, country, whatever, what would that look like?
I'm going to defer on this one. It's all you, because I'm not trying to be CEO or king of it.
I'm definitely not. I was a CEO once. You know, I gave the job to someone else. But I would say there's a huge amount of wisdom on this subject. It all dates to before the 20th century. You know, if you want me to get the sort of shortest summary of that wisdom, there's this great Latin phrase, "Salus populi suprema lex," which means the health of the people is the supreme law. Kind of more relevant maybe now than at other times, or more literal now than at other times. You know, but it means sort of health in the broadest sense. It means what Thomas Carlyle called the condition of England. You know, and you know, that's a very different question than, like, are we maximizing GDP, for example? It's a very different question. Actually, maximizing GDP, in a sense, you're saying, you know, consumption is the greatest good. It's like luxus populi suprema lex. And popular luxury is the supreme law. That's what you mean when you say we're going to maximize GDP. And when you're basically saying we're going to maximize the health of the people, it's like, look at the health of the American people. Look at the health of basically anywhere that isn't like here. Like, anywhere that isn't San Francisco, LA, or like, and you'll just go, the amount of just like deserted, ruined America. Ever taken like a train down the Acela corridor? It's just like ruins nonstop down that whole train corridor, between Boston and New York, Boston and certainly New York and DC. And so you're like, basically, when I look very abstractly at this country, I see a country in very poor condition. I see a lot of ruins. I see a lot of ruined physicality. I see a lot of ruined human beings. I see like this country's fucked, right? But the GDP is great. GDP is going up. Well,
it's interesting because yet again, this is like the 5th time I'll flag. This is a weird convergence with left-wing talking points, right? Like there's a left-wing critique. It shouldn't be all about growth. It shouldn't be all about money, man. It shouldn't be all about GDP. It should be about larger, more important values such as health, right? So I'm just flagging this. I just think it's interesting. Any other questions? We got one here. Yeah.
So, money system. Is it? Adam Smith talks about the invisible hand guiding the market. So it seems to me that's an exemplar of
government without government.
an informal system. Would you formalize it?
I would say when you look at, Adam Smith is very much part of this kind of British, Enlightenment from, the 18th century. And one of the things that those people love to come up with is essentially kind of decentralized, kind of centerless systems. And, Adam Smith's invisible hand is very, very beautiful. And, it's sort of the beauty of that struck the people who understood the kind of everything before Adam Smith is basically what's called mercantilism, which is basically the economic theories of Xi Jinping. So, if you want to go to Detroit and then go to Shanghai, and you can tell me how those systems compete, because one of them is run according to Adam Smith and the other one is run according to pre-Adam Smith. And so people are looking for these kind of autonomous invisible hands, and in a way they're the exception that proves the rule, because there are certain situations under which they function very, very well. They're very, very useful tools, but they're not really a replacement for an actual government.
All right. Excellent. I want to call for some crazy questions. Give me something crazy.
Shit.
Like, you've all been so patient listening. We've been very serious. We've been professional. We've covered all the important stuff. But give me something challenging, something crazy and difficult and weird. We're doing shots up here. We've already talked about Hitler and shit. Like, let's take this up a notch. This is time. We've all been drinking. Let's take it up. What do you got?
We're still recording.
Who's got something good? Yeah.
Fuck, marry, or kill.
There you go.
Robespierre, Kant, and Sade.
Whoa.
Wow.
All men. So.
Yeah. No. I'm more abstractly than concretely a believer in gay marriage, but I'm gonna have to go with Kant, and Robespierre and Sade can marry each other and go to hell together.
What else you got? Yeah, Michael, is it? Michael.
So roughly imagining, looking at the political spectrum right now, Bernie versus Trump, populism on the rise. The next 10 years, I imagine polarization, upheaval seems to be kind of inevitable on the larger scale. And so
I think you should think of it as
kind of
lit.
inevitable. Yeah.
Fire.
We could be
That's fire.
language with it, but I feel more radical ideas aren't going to be so much off the table, even beyond what's currently people are getting deranged about what's
Hell
currently
yeah.
on the table. So
Hell yeah.
Well, we see where we should proceed in this way, where Bannon, I feel, is the only one who's really taking the vision towards the future on the main stage.
Yeah. I want to say that media has reported that I am no Steve Bannon. I do not actually know Steve Bannon.
You don't?
No, I don't. I've never interacted with him or met him at all, as far as I'm aware.
I think he's pretty based, honestly. I gotta admit that. That's like my guilty.
Well,
my guilty
as soon as he was falsely reported as being connected with me, I could not have any interest in him anymore. But the idea. I mean, sure, let's be Leninists, right? I don't know. I think the thing that's nice about Bernie versus Trump or whatever is that there's a sort of mask off quality to both of them, or like mask half off or something. And so you're like, the reason why Trump and Bernie, I'm still hoping Bernie wins out. Let's see what happens. But
you're rooting for Bernie over Trump.
Well, I'm rooting for Bernie over, Biden and Buttigieg. And,
based.
Yeah, definitely for Bernie. And
that's interesting.
Well,
that's interesting.
I mean, Bernie.
I don't think many people would predict that.
Bernie, he has. I can't really do this, but I've had too many shots. But he has the same accent as my grandfather. It's like my grandparents actually met. They met. My grandma and grandpa actually met at a Communist Party meeting in the 1930s. And the last conversation I ever had with my grandmother before she fell down the stairs at Juilliard and broke her head, as I was like, was it true that you and Grandpa met at a Communist Party meeting? And she's like, oh, no. That was the American League for Peace and Freedom. My grandmother doesn't know that Google exists, So, very, very readily seen as a communist front, right? But what's so amazing about that period is that, and it's nothing to do with being a blogger or anything, they would not even admit to their own grandson that they were part of the party. I only know this from my parents.
Wow, really?
And they were in the party from the 30s through the 70s. I have my father's World War II letters home from Germany, where he's fighting in the infantry, to my grandmother. They're mainly about party stuff. And I'm like, tell me some war stories, Grandpa.
Huh.
But no, he's the correct line is so I mean, this is a really, really deep American thing, right? This is not a fringe thing. This is, the experience of American communism, which is part of Bernie's heritage, whether he wants to talk about it or not, is a really deep American experience. And I think it's more American than Trump in many, many ways. And it's far more American than Trump. It's far older and far deeper. And so to see that basically, what the DNC is constantly telling Bernie is dude, you're taking the mask off. You can't do that. What the fuck? They're seeing who and Bernie is like, no, I think actually it's time for candor. And I think basically when you show the people something real and something fake, just as when you show them Trump and all the people running against Trump, they're like, you know what, Trump, this blowhard is actually way more real than all of these strange plastic people like Rubio,
right.
And I think that's true of basically Sanders. It's like Trump and Rubio are like Sanders and Buttigieg, right?
All right, I think, should I cut you off there? Is that cool?
Cut me off,
that
please.
Was,
I've
was really interesting.
too many people already.
No, that was great. I just want to let a lot of people talk. That was interesting to know that you're based on Bernie. Actually, I think my buddy Elliot Rosenstock maybe has a question.
I do also want Bernie to beat Trump.
So that's interesting. I don't think many people would predict that you would rather Bernie beat Trump.
I endorsed Obama twice.
That's interesting. Not many people know that. I think people have different priors about you. So that's revealing. Who else? Who's got something good, man? We're getting raucous here. Seriously. All right, Elliot, man, what's up? Elliot Rosenstock.
So benevolent dictatorship, is that not essentially Marxist-Leninism? The attempt is.
Are you talking about democratic centralism? Are you saying that the proletarian will can only be made effective through a proletarian vanguard?
Well, no, I'm saying no, none of that. I'm not doing any of that too. Right? I'm really not making a pitch. I mean, literally, say Kim Jong-un owns North Korea under his name. But hypothetically, communism is this benevolent system. Is that not the benevolent?
I think what you'll find if you look at the case of Kim Jong-un specifically, I think my policy, I hate to do this. If I were king, the way I would treat Kim Jong-un is basically Kim Jong-un is in a very uncomfortable position because he's at war against the whole world and he's at war against his whole country and he can trust no one. And basically, if anyone manages to stab him in the back, he's gone. And so in a way, he's in a very similar position to like Stalin in the 1930s, which is that he dies if he can't hold power. And, his only way of holding power is to be incredibly brutal, which is a really fucked up situation. And so, if you were, like, I think if the U.S. were able to say, Kim Jong-un was educated in Switzerland. He went to, like, a school in Geneva. I'm sure he speaks perfectly good English. And you know what?
That's lit. What's that?
Big Dennis Rodman fan, too. He's just
That's
like us.
lit.
And, the thing is that, if there was a wise, enlightened, maybe a benevolent dictator in charge of the United States, somehow you could imagine that, and, that person could be like, say to Kim Jong-un, look, and say credibly, which is the real problem, look, man, it's a fucked up situation. Here's what we got for you. We got $1 billion. We got, plus the $1 billion, we got this amazing place in the south of France. Okay? And third thing is we have a plane. You want to get on the plane, you'll be a billionaire in the south of France, and we'll give North Korea to South Korea, and they can fix the place up. And he would, very confident, take that deal in a hurry. And so, and you'd free the people of North Korea without, like, any, like, ridiculous, Korean War 2.0 or something. And so, in a way, like, when you look at the kind of power base of someone like that, you're like, you can actually see why he can't be a benevolent dictator. Like, there's just no way, even if you wanted to be one, he couldn't. So, another example is you look at the fate of Russia and China after the fall of communism. Russia falls apart. China is like, we can actually allow private corporations because we're strong enough that they won't, like, overthrow the state and kill us. So, actually, Deng Xiaoping can be a benevolent dictator. And it's a sort of, it's not weakness that creates that strength. It's actually strength that allows that benevolence. Deng Xiaoping could be a benevolent dictator because of the strength created by Mao, who was anything but a benevolent dictator.
All right. Excellent answer. Who's next? Give us something good. What do you got? I'm just going to go in the order I saw it. Go ahead.
Earlier you said that all true artists grit. I have a question from the Tech Wars fan network.
Thank you, sir.
Will you go back on Tech Wars?
I will at least consider it.
All right.
Seriously, dude, that's your question?
It's a great question.
I got nothing but love for Tech
My
Wars.
answer for the Tech Wars, but the right thing, is another guest. Give me a three-way. I want a three-way.
Three-way? Okay.
Three-way.
I'll let him know.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. What do you got?
I feel like one of the most important group distinctions that no one ever talks about is like high IQ versus low IQ.
Dude.
Controversial. There you go.
Take it, man. Go for it.
Go. Yeah, let's hear it.
No, you go. Oh, I think he's just giving
I have
you.
to go?
Yeah.
Was that a question?
I think one of them, I think that's an important thread throughout all of history is like the masses versus the high IQ elite. I think that's a useful frame for all of history.
And one of the it is a useful frame. I mean, it's essentially the forces of democracy versus the forces of oligarchy, and what's clearly dominant in terms of who calls the shots today, despite bullshit like the Trump administration, is oligarchy. If you look at that as a conflict where basically it's like, or black versus white or whatever the fuck, like one side, like the idea of thinking in terms of any government that is sane in terms of like a conflict, like is this government going to be like better for like high IQ people or low IQ people or like Asians or whites or whatever the fuck? As soon as you're thinking in those terms, those are basically the terms of civil war. And those are just sort of retarded terms to think in terms of, if you'll excuse the phrase. But I mean it as pejoratively as possible. Like, it's really bad to think of that as a natural conflict is really, really bad. And so when you're thinking in terms of like solus populi supreme lex, you have to acknowledge that both high IQ and low IQ people are people. You're with me on that?
Amen.
Amen. And so, in a sense, our society...
There is a natural conflict there, more naturally than between other groups. That's the point, right?
I don't think there's a conflict at all. I think they work together really, really well. And I think that it's true that if you assume that you're in a society in conflict somehow, and if you assume that conflict is essential to the nature of a political society, which is a pretty core assumption in democracy, yeah, you're going to get that. But I don't really believe that at all.
Honestly, I think if there's a conflict, Curtis is the star of the show, not me, but if there's a conflict, it's the high IQ people exploiting the low IQ people. Like all these fucking woke-ass left-wing professors and shit, those are high IQ people essentially manipulating lower IQ people on their own team for their own self-interest.
So if you're thinking in terms of solus populi suprema lex, you have to admit that, if lower IQ people are people too. We're going to go with that. Then, what does their health mean? And, to me, what their health means is simply that, they, like other people, should be able to fulfill their potential to the maximum, they should fulfill their maximum human potential, because that's what makes them as healthy as possible. Does that mean they're going to be quantum physicists? No. But does that mean that, they can't be, master shoemakers? No, I don't think so. And the thing is, I have a great story about this, which is, Daniel Day-Lewis.
Heard of him?
Yeah. So Daniel Day-Lewis is not only a star actor, but a member of, his father was Cecil Day-Lewis, the poet. This is the most patrician person imaginable. And, of course, wealthy beyond your imagining. Daniel Day-Lewis, you might have seen him in My Left Foot. He took 2 years off of his career to apprentice in Italy to become a master shoemaker. So, in a sense, I'm like, if it's good enough for Daniel Day-Lewis, it's basically good enough for J. Random low IQ person. But how do you actually make that happen?
Hell yeah, especially nowadays, that shit's a badass, right? If you can actually do shit like make shoes, chicks want to fuck you, that's impressive, right? I mean, no, seriously, nowadays, it's like that shit's relatively high status in certain cultures.
Who made your shoes, Justin?
It's probably very underpaid workers in a third world country, unfortunately.
Yeah, probably Vietnam.
Yeah. What else we got? Yeah, what do you got?
So you spoke about contradictions and interventions, and you spoke about a certain mechanism for intervention as like a pill dispenser.
That was Justin's term, but sure.
Right. Yeah. I just this is what I'm getting, and so I was actually wanted you to elaborate on the sense in which interventions could be described as a pill dispenser.
So, when you have an intervention, let's say, your sister is a heroin addict or whatever, basically you're like, you sit her down and you're basically like, you've made bad choices and I love you. And so, the essence of like, you've made bad choices and I love you is like, that's the way that all those conversations need to be structured. So you're basically not saying, and so you're saying, I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm not trying to fight against you. You actually have a disease which causes you to be doing these insane, crazy things and be saying these just ridiculous things. And I'm actually on the side of the good person that I see inside you, which is a very different way to sort of proceed than the we're going to war over our ideas over which idea is better or worse and, whatever. That's a very unproductive way of doing dialogue. I mean, the intervention is very, very hard. It rarely succeeds, but it's the only thing that has a chance to succeed.
Has your open letter to leftists converted many leftists? Do you ever get emails from leftists saying, oh man, that really touched me?
Actually, if you email moldbug@gmail.com, I don't read it. So I'm sure there's a huge, I've definitely it's,
because your open letter, I think your open letter to leftists, I think if you're curious about this interesting
open letter
man
to
here
an open-minded progressive.
And you haven't read any of his
that.
blog, I think that's a really good place to start. It's really fun. I mean, you're definitely very good at hacking into people's presuppositions and kind of luring them down roads that are logically kind of undeniable, but that they don't necessarily want to go down. I'm just kind of curious.
Well,
do you have evidence of success?
Oh, yes, I definitely.
Red pilling people?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, actually most, it's actually much harder to red pill conservatives. It's really, really hard. I work really hard on that, but it's very, very difficult. It's like the cultural, gap between these is really, really great. But, whereas, progressives, I'm one of these people. I speak their language. I have their ideals. It's much easier for me.
Because your grandparents were
communists,
Jewish
right. Communists in Brooklyn.
And one of your parents worked for the
State Department.
That's right.
My State Department of Energy. My stepfather was on the Hill for 20 years.
Right, so you're really kind of internal to this milieu. You're not
I never worked there myself, but I sort of had, the experience of it growing up in a sense.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, the whole thing needs to be, well, I was about to say it needs to be set on fire, but, I mean that in the nicest possible way.
All right, so what else do we got? What do you got? My man right here.
You seem to insist. Yeah. You seem to insist that like all the best things you said are the negative things and not the positive ones, and perhaps that's why you call everything that's occurred tonight bullshit, because we're interested in hearing some positive things you have to say. And on that, I wonder if you do have something positive to say, not about ideas, but about pragmatics, because you have to be doing something.
Well, so the question is, we've been forgetting to repeat the questions because we're amateurs, but the question is basically, you insist on the negative ideas being more relevant than the positive ideas. I would say that the negative ideas are much better formed and much clearer and much more relevant than any of the positive ones. The positive ones are just not relevant yet because we're not in a world where they could possibly matter. Nonetheless, it's important to, in a sense, like sort of develop that vision. If anyone wants to, try their hand at writing crap like this, there's a genre actually that used to exist but no longer exists. Really a medieval, even pre-Enlightenment genre, basically called the Mirror for Princes. And a Mirror for Princes, in a way, Machiavelli's Prince is kind of in this genre, although it kind of breaks the genre. A Mirror for Princes is a book written by an ordinary intellectual, basically as a guide for what to do if you're a prince. And of course, being a prince in that sense means being a real or rather absolute monarch. So in a sense, there are many, many reasons why you can't have any kind of monarchy, absolute or otherwise, in this country today. Like, I could reel off 10 probably. But one of them is simply you just have no one has any idea what this person would do. Or what would be the kind of, like, people think of public policy in terms of how do you change this thing that is DC and make it into something else, which is just impossible. But, no one thinks, oh, what would be done with this if you didn't have to obey any of its ridiculous policies and procedures at all.
All right. How about maybe one or two more, but they better be fucking edgy, goddammit. I'm like trying to, I want to be excited here. I mean, these are all good questions. Seriously, I mean, but I'm like, I'm waiting for things to get dicey. You know what I mean? Like, we're taking shots and shit. Hang tight. Anyone else? Anyone who jumps up too quickly at that, I'm a little like.
Also, it's better if you haven't asked a question before.
Yeah, someone who hasn't.
Yeah, that guy
over there. What's up, man?
With a beard. You're gonna have to shave that beard for your mask,
You got it. So Jeff Bezos is one of the most wealthy, powerful individuals on the planet right now, and he has been devoting a large amount of his fortune to space exploration. So as a sort of ideal, like, CEO king kind of thing, I could see him being someone who would become a space-based CEO king. So could you speak on?
Well, space is, I'm not super, I love, like, I mean, Elon Musk is amazing. I mean, who would not find Elon Musk amazing? But, Mars is, let's colonize Antarctica first. I'm one of these Antarctica first people. It's funny, it's like when you talk about, like, Bezos or Musk or, Jobs, or these are really very exceptional people. Even for, large-scale CEOs, they're really, they're people who in another situation would be historic figures, and perhaps they're historic figures anyway. That would be great. But honestly, you could take any one of the Fortune 500 CEOs and you'd do fine.
Excellent. Very good short answer. I'm getting some signals from my more socially calibrated friends.
People's butts are starting to hurt.
Yeah, maybe we're talking too long. I could just talk about the shit forever. So
you should have done an intermission, man. There should have been an intermission.
No, dude. I'm told that LA has enough fucking music and enough fucking bullshit, and LA doesn't have enough, like, long fucking talks. So that's what we delivered. But I don't want to push the envelope. All right. So this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming out. We're gonna still hang out. We're gonna be playing some music. There's still beer and Jack Daniels and pizza at the bar if you want some. And real quick, all I want to say real quick before we wrap this up, and everyone should hang out, socialize, talk shit with each other, and chill. We're gonna play some SoundCloud rap and shit like that. Super lit, fire shit. But real quick, I need to give a shout out to my man Barrett Avner right here, and yep, and Alex Talon right here.
And I'd like to thank Justin for organizing the evening. He seems to be doing. I don't know if he looks like a David Geffen. I think less hair, maybe. But Geffen had this kind of Jufro, like my dad. But I think you're doing great, and I'd really like to huge thank you for Justin for organizing. This, and to the staff for putting it together.
Thank you, Curtis, for driving all the way down here.
And to the audience for coming here and being here and having a good time. And let's thank you, everyone.
Oh, yeah. All right, all I would say is that if you're local to this area and you're interested in doing more shit like this, talk to these guys. Alex and Barrett of Contain, they're really interested in doing more stuff like this. So there needs to be more stuff of this. As I said at the beginning, if you walked in late, more than 5 people flew here from another state for this. Okay? There's massive demand for just radical, truly independent, truly free, dangerous intellectual exchange and discussion and events. Put them on. That we need more of them. People want it. If you make it, they will come. Don't be afraid. Don't be a fucking pussy. Do real shit. People will come. If people are flying to this, people will come to your local shit. Do it. That's my exhortation to you all. Thank you so much for coming. And now let's party a little bit. Yeah? Cheers.